Welcome to Calming Bedtime Journeys channel. Tonight we travel back into a quiet turning point in human history, where the world begins to feel slightly larger than maps can explain, and where distant oceans start to whisper promises of spice, silk, and unknown fortunes waiting beyond the horizon. You're not simply observing history, you are drifting inside it, as if your awareness is gently placed into the mind of someone standing on a wooden dock in early modern Europe. Watching ships sway like patient animals in the tide, the air is cool, faintly salted, carrying the smell of tarred rope and wet timber. Lantern light flickers softly across worn planks, and distant bells echo through harbour fog. So, before you settle into the story, take a second to like the video and hit subscribe. Now, dim the lights. You stand in a Europe that feels both familiar and constrained, where daily life is shaped by local fields, narrow trade routes, and slow-moving caravans that rarely travel far beyond regional borders. Yet beneath that contained world, something is shifting. Merchants speak in quieter tones about lands they have never seen. Aromatic spices arrive in small quantities, precious enough to be weighed like gold. Pepper alone can determine fortunes, and cinnamon carries the scent of distant forest you can only imagine. A mainstream historical fact settles here gently by the late 15th and early 16th centuries. European demand for Asian spices had grown into a powerful economic force, driving exploration across oceans. You feel this demand almost physically, like a tension in the air around crowded marketplaces, where every handful of cloves or pinch of nutmeg feels like a fragment of a faraway world. You walk through these markets now, hearing the rough scrape of wooden carts. The sound of merchants calling prices rises and falls like waves. The smell of dried herbs mixes with animal hides and smoke from nearby hearths. Your fingers brush coarse fabric sacks filled with goods that once travelled thousands of miles. Nothing here feels ordinary anymore. Everything feels connected to something beyond sight. A quirky tidbit surfaces quietly in conversation near a stall. Some traders once believed nutmeg could protect against plague if worn around the neck. You almost smile at the thought, because in this era, imagination often travels faster than scientific understanding. Belief and commerce move together, shaping decisions that feel both practical and strangely symbolic. You continue forward through this unfolding world. Wooden signs creak above narrow streets. Church bells mark time in steady intervals. The ground beneath your steps is uneven stone, polished by centuries of movement. Horses pull carts loaded with wool, grain, and early luxury goods. Everything feels local, yet everything is slowly being pulled outward. Historians still debate whether it was pure economic necessity or a deeper cultural restlessness that pushed European powers toward maritime expansion. You sense that uncertainty now, not as an argument, but as a quiet hesitation embedded in the atmosphere itself. It feels like standing at the edge of a shoreline, unsure whether the next step leads into safety or transformation. You notice how conversations change when trade is mentioned. Voices lower slightly, eyes shift toward distant ideas rather than nearby concerns. Maps are no longer simple tools, they are becoming ambitions. Hand-drawn coastlines suggest lands filled with gold, spices, and unfamiliar civilizations, even when inaccurate. They carry emotional weight, shaping decisions that will ripple across centuries. The smell of salt grows stronger in your imagination as you move closer to the harbour district. Wooden ships creak against their moorings, ropes tightening and loosening with the tide. Sailors shout instructions in mixed dialects. Their boots strike wet decks with steady rhythm. The sound is repetitive, almost soothing, like a heartbeat shared between ship and sea. You pause near the edge of the dock. Water moves slowly, reflecting broken fragments of sky. Seagulls circle overhead, their calls sharp but distant, fading into wind, Lanterns sway gently as evening approaches. There is a sense of anticipation here, not dramatic, but persistent, like something preparing itself without revealing what it will become. A mainstream historical fact emerges again through this atmosphere. European maritime exploration was increasingly supported by emerging financial partnerships, early joint ventures, and charterist agreements that spread risk among investors. You can feel this shift not as theory, but as a change in how people speak about danger. Risk is no longer personal, it is distributed, calculated, shared. You imagine the first voyages leaving these shores, ships heavy with provisions, navigators relying on imperfect instruments, stars becoming guides across unknown waters. The ocean is not empty in your mind, it is dense with possibility and uncertainty, stretching far beyond comprehension. A quiet wooden bench near the dock invites you to sit. You do not sit to rest, you sit to observe. The surface is damp, slightly rough beneath your palms. The air carries a mix of brine and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a rope snaps lightly in the wind, a sound so small it feels almost intimate. Historians still argue whether the earliest push toward oceanic expansion was driven more by curiosity or by economic pressure. That question lingers here without resolution. It does not demand an answer. It simply exists, like the tide itself, returning again and again without final explanation. You rise slowly and look outward once more. The horizon is not dramatic. It is calm, almost indifferent, yet it holds everything that will follow. Empires, companies, wars, and trade routes all begin here in a space that feels deceptively simple. The wind shifts slightly, brushing across your face with a cool persistence. You feel the texture of that, like a reminder that movement is inevitable. Nothing in this world remains still for long, even when it appears quiet. You take one last look at the harbour. Lantern light flickers across water, voices fade into distance. The scent of salt and wood lingers in the air like memory itself. You move forward now into quieter rooms where history changes shape without the sound of waves or the presence of ships. The sea is no longer directly in front of you, yet it still exists in every sentence spoken here, in every folded map, in every inked signature pressed onto parchment under dim candlelight. The air is warmer in these interiors, carrying the faint smell of wax, ink, and aged paper. Wooden beams creak softly above you as if the building itself is listening. You enter chambers where decisions are not made loudly, they are negotiated slowly through careful language and controlled patience. The light is low, flickering across carved desks and scattered documents. Shadows gather in corners like silent observers. A quill scratches across paper. Steady and deliberate, each stroke feels heavier than it should, as if it carries consequences far beyond the room. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Gently European monarchs granted royal charters to private trading companies, allowing them to operate with extraordinary privileges overseas. You feel the weight of this shift not as a legal concept, but as a quiet transformation of power. Authority is no longer held only by crowns and parliaments. It begins to extend outward into private hands, carried across oceans. The room you stand in feels enclosed, but strangely expansive in imagination. A map lies open on the table. Coastlines are drawn with uneven confidence, edges fading into unknown space. Small marks indicate ports, rivers, and rumoured cities. Each symbol represents not just geography, but expectation. You lean closer and notice faint stains on the parchment, possibly from hands that trace these routes too many times in anxious thought. The smell here is different from the harbour. It is deeper, more still. Wax from candles drips slowly down their sides. Ink bottles glint under soft light. The sound of distant footsteps in a corridor fades quickly. leaving only the subtle rustle of paper turning. Everything feels measured. Even the walnuts has structure. A quirky historical detail slips into awareness through conversation near the doorway. Some early company investors believed that holding shares in overseas trade ventures was as spiritually promising as it was financially rewarding, as if commerce itself carried moral elevation. You do not hear this as a joke or a truth. It simply exists as a reflection of how belief and economics intertwine in unexpected ways. You walk further into the chamber where discussions grow more precise. Voices are calm but firm. Contracts are examined line by line. Seals are prepared. Wax is warmed. A signet ring presses into soft red wax, leaving a mark that will travel farther than the person who made it. There is something almost ritualistic about it, like an oath performed through bureaucracy. Historians still argue whether these early chartered companies were primarily instruments of state control or independent commercial experiments that gradually escaped oversight. You feel that uncertainty in the room itself. It lingers between sentences. It sits in pauses where no one speaks, yet decisions are still forming. Outside these walls, Europe remains fragmented into kingdoms and competing interests. Inside, however, something different is forming, a structure that is neither fully public nor fully private. You sense it as a quiet innovation in how power can be organized. It does not replace existing systems. It attaches itself to them like an extension. A candle near you flickers as a draft passes through a narrow window. The flame bends, then steadies again. The motion is small, but it feels symbolic, like instability learning how to hold its shape. You notice how carefully everyone avoids unnecessary movement. Even shifting in a chair feels deliberate. You imagine the journeys these decisions will trigger. Ships leaving ports that still feel distant from these rooms. Crews assembling provisions, navigators checking instruments they barely trust. Cargo holds filling with cloth, metal, and carefully measured trade goods. None of that is visible here. Yet everything begins here. The sound of ink scratching resumes. Another signature is added. Another seal is pressed. A document is folded and placed into a wooden box lined with cloth. It will travel by courier, then by ship, then across seas that most people in this room will never see. A mainstream historical fact appears again through this process. Chartered companies often combined commercial trade rights with administrative and military authority in distant territories. You feel how unusual this is. Trade is no longer just exchange. It becomes structure. It becomes governance. It becomes presence. You walk toward a Tkaweeble where a large ledger is open. Numbers are carefully recorded in neat columns. Profits, losses, investments, expected returns. Each figure represents risk translated into language that feels stable. The act of writing seems to contain uncertainty, as if ink can hold back unpredictability. The air grows heavier as more candles are lit. Wax pools on plates beneath them. Shadows multiply across the walls. The room feels less like a place of conversation and more like a vessel carrying decisions forward through time. A faint memory of the harbour returns to you. The sound of waves, the smell of salt, the openness of the horizon. That world now feels distant. Even though it is only a short distance away in space here, everything is inward, everything is controlled. Historians still debate whether the charter system was a deliberate strategy of empire building, or a series of pragmatic decisions made under financial pressure. That question does not resolve itself here. Instead, it lingers in the background like a second layer of thought, unseen but always present. You step back toward the doorway. The corridor beyond is dim, leading away from the concentrated stillness of the decision room. As you move, the sound of paper fades behind you. The smell of ink softens. The air becomes cooler again. Yet something follows you. Not physically, but conceptually. The idea that private enterprise can carry state-like authority across oceans. The idea that commerce can become structure. The idea that a company is no longer just a group of merchants, but a system capable of shaping distant worlds. You pause at the threshold. Behind you, the room continues its quiet operations. Ahead, the world of ships and oceans waits without patience. The bridge between them has already been formed in ink and wax. You take a slow breath. The air feels lighter now, but not simpler. It carries the beginning of something vast. Something that will travel farther than anyone in this room can imagine. You leave the candle-lit chambers behind, and the world opens suddenly into wind and motion again. The quiet corridors of ink and wax dissolve into the sharp salt air of the harbour. Wooden planks beneath your feet feel uneven, worn down by centuries of footsteps and rolling cargo. The atmosphere shifts immediately. It is louder here, wider, less contained. You hear the constant rhythm of water striking hulls, ropes tightening under strain, and distant shouting carried across the docks. The smell changes too. Tar, seaweed, wet timber, and iron fittings blend into a dense coastal scent that clings to your senses. It is not gentle. It is persistent, almost physical. The wind pushes against your shoulders as if urging you forward, towards ships that wait with patient inevitability. Their masts rise like skeletal trees against a pale sky. You walk along the edge of the harbour where early oceanic voyages are being prepared. A mainstream historical fact anchors this moment clearly during the 15th and 16th centuries. European maritime expansion intensified as explorers sought direct sea routes to Asia. You feel that ambition here in the loaded silence before departure, in the careful stacking of barrels, in the measured tension of crews preparing for uncertainty. Sailors move with practiced urgency. Some carry coils of rope over their shoulders. Others inspect sails patched and repatched from previous journeys. The fabric flutters faintly in the wind, like something alive but restrained. The wooden hulls creak as cargo is loaded deeper into the ships. Every motion feels purposeful, as if the entire harbour is holding its breath between one moment and the next. You step closer to a vessel anchored near the dock. Its surface is darkened by pitch and salt. You place your hand briefly on the side of the hull. It is rough, warm from sunlight, and vibrates slightly with the movement of water below. The sensation travels through your palm like a reminder that these ships are not still objects. They are temporary living systems designed for endurance. A quirky historical detail appears through a passing sailor's conversation. Some crews once believed that carrying certain religious charms or carved figures would calm storms or prevent scurvy. You hear it not as superstition to be judged, but as a reflection of how fragile these journeys truly felt. When survival depends on uncertain waters, belief becomes part of navigation. You climb a short ramp onto the deck. The wood creaks under your weight. The deck is crowded with barrels, ropes, and bundled supplies. Everything is secured tightly, but nothing feels fully stable. The horizon stretches beyond the ship, flat and indifferent. There is no visible end to the water, only gradual fading into pale sky. The wind is stronger here. It carries cold moisture that touches your skin and disappears instantly. You taste salt faintly on your lips. The air feels open in a way that is almost overwhelming after the enclosed rooms of decision-making you left behind. You notice how your senses adjust, becoming sharper, more alert. Historians still argue whether early ocean voyages were driven more by calculated economic ambition or by a deeper cultural curiosity about the unknown world. Standing here, that question feels less like theory and more like lived tension. You can sense both impulses at once. Practical necessity and imaginative reach coexist in the same movement of preparation. Below deck, you hear muffled sounds of storage being secured. Wooden crates shift slightly, metal tools clink softly, someone calls out instructions in a dialect you only partially recognize. Language itself feels fragmented here. shaped by ports, trade routes, and mixed crews drawn from the different regions. A sailor adjusts a rope beside you. His hands are weathered, skin darkened by sun and salt exposure. He does not look at the horizon with romantic expectation. He looks at it as distance that must be crossed with precision. His focus is practical, grounded. The ocean is not symbolic to him, it is operational. A mainstream historical fact emerges again through the environment. Early European ships relied heavily on evolving navigation tools such as the compass, astrolabe, and rudimentary charts. You imagine how fragile this knowledge must have felt when placed against the vastness of open water. Yet these instruments represented confidence, however limited, in the possibility of structured movement across uncertainty. You walk toward the stern of the ship. The water behind it is restless, broken into shifting patterns of light and shadow. Seagulls circle overhead, their calls sharp and fading. The dock is now slightly distant. You can still see movement on shore, but it feels separated, like a different world already. A bell rings softly, not loud but distinct. It signals preparation rather than departure. The crew responds with subtle changes in posture. Ropes are checked again. Cargo is adjusted. The ship feels like it is gathering itself inward before releasing into motion. You lean on the railing. The wood is cool and slightly damp. The ocean air presses gently against your face, though. It carries a strange mixture of calm and tension, as if stillness and movement are existing at the same time. You realize that this moment is not about action yet. It is about readiness. Historians still debate whether the psychological experience of early sailors was dominated more by fear of the unknown or by disciplined acceptance of risk. You sense both quietly present here. Fear is not loud, it is contained. Acceptance is not peaceful, it is necessary. A final load of supplies is lifted aboard. The ship dips slightly under weight, then steadies. The water around the hull shifts in response, creating small ripples that spread outward and disappear. Everything feels interconnected in subtle ways, movement always producing reaction. You take one last look toward the harbour. It is still visible, still grounded, still familiar, but it already feels slightly distant, as if the ship is mentally separated from it even before physically leaving. The wind strengthens for a moment, pulling at sails, testing rigging. The ship responds with quiet resilience. You feel the anticipation settle deeper now, not as excitement, but as inevitability. Something is about to begin that cannot be reversed. You stand there, surrounded by wood, rope, salt, and sky. The ocean stretches forward without instruction. The world behind you holds safety, structure, and familiarity. The world ahead holds movement without certainty. And between those two states, you remain still, listening to the slow breathing of a ship preparing to leave everything known behind. You leave the wooden decks and shifting sails behind, and the world shifts again, this time into a colder, more structured kind of ambition. The wind still exists, but it is no longer the dominant force. Instead, calculation begins to take its place. You find yourself moving through a different maritime culture, one where organization feels sharper, almost mechanical, and where trade is no longer just exploration but disciplined expansion. The harbour you enter feels more controlled than the ones before. Ships are still large, still wooden, still vulnerable to the sea, but their movement is coordinated with an almost architectural precision. Cranes swing in measured arcs. Dock workers follow timed sequences. Cargo is logged, weighed, and sealed with bureaucratic care. The soundscape is still filled with water and wind, yet underneath it lies something new order. The air is cool and slightly metallic, carrying the scent of damp timber, iron nails, and smoked fish stacked in crates. You hear Dutch spoken in quick, efficient bursts, cutting through the ambient noise like a tool shaped for speed. Everything here feels streamlined, as if inefficiency has already been filtered out of daily life. You are now walking within the world of the Dutch East India Company, a structure often regarded by economic historians as one of the earliest large-scale joint stock corporations. This was not just a trading enterprise, it was a system designed to concentrate capital, distribute the risk, and operate across continents with a level of coordination that early emergent ventures could not sustain. The concept feels almost invisible at first, but you begin to notice it in details. Sailors are not just hired for voyages, they are part of a larger financial mechanism. Ships are not just vessels, they are mobile investments. Cargo is not just goods, it is capital in motion. Even the ocean itself feels partially organized by accounting logic, as if distance has been converted into numbers. You pause near a large warehouse. Its walls are thick, reinforced, and lined with narrow windows. Inside, spices are stacked in carefully labelled containers. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon are treated with a level of attention that feels almost ceremonial. The scent is overwhelming, warm and sharp at the same time, clinging to your breath. A mainstream historical fact appears here through observation rather than explanation. The Dutch East India Company developed a sophisticated system of shareholder investment that allowed ordinary investors in European cities to indirectly participate in global trade. You sense how unusual this is for the time. Wealth is no longer tied only to land or direct trade journeys. It's becoming abstract, transferable and distant. You run your hand along the edge of a crate. The wood is smooth from handling, stamped with markings that indicate origin and destination. These symbols form a quiet language of global movement. Each mark represents a journey already completed or about to begin. Nothing here feels isolated. Everything is connected through routes that stretch far beyond sight. A quirky historical detail surfaces in a conversation between dock workers. Some early investors believed that spices carried not just flavour, but subtle medicinal and even spiritual properties that justified their extraordinary value. You listen without judgment in this environment. Belief and profit are often intertwined in ways that modern logic struggles to separate cleanly. You continue deeper into the harbour complex. The scale becomes more apparent. Rows of ships are prepared simultaneously, their sails folded like sleeping wings. Maintenance crews move along hulls checking for damage. Tar is applied in thick layers to protect against saltwater decay. The smell is heavy, almost intoxicating. The Dutch system emphasises repetition and efficiency. You notice how tasks are standardised. Rope handling follows consistent patterns. Cargo loading is divided into segments. Even communication feels reduced to essential signals. This is not chaos managed. It is structure extended outward into motion. Scholars examining early modern trade systems often emphasize how the Dutch model transformed commerce into something resembling a continuous network rather than isolated voyages. You feel that network here, not as theory, but as atmosphere. Every ship is a node, every port is a connection point. Every decision reverberates across distant locations. You step onto a quay where water laps gently against stone edges. The tide moves slowly, but even that movement feels integrated into human planning. Timetables determine when ships depart. Winds are studied with increasing attention. Nature is not opposed, but incorporated. A sailor nearby adjusts a sail with practiced ease. His movements are economical, almost silent. He does not look toward the horizon with wonder. He looks at it as a space already measured in previous calculations. His confidence comes from repetition, not speculation. You notice ledger books being carried between offices and ships. These books feel heavier than their physical weight suggests. Inside them, numbers track entire journeys. Costs, returns, losses, expected gains. Each page compresses months of uncertainty into structured summaries. Historians still debate whether the rise of this corporate model represented genuine innovation in global cooperation, or the early formation of systems that would later enable large-scale exploitation. That tension is not resolved here. Instead, it lingers quietly in the background, like a second tide moving beneath the visible surface. You walk toward a taller structure at the edge of the harbour. From its upper windows, officials observe ship movements and coordinate departures. The view is expansive. You can see the harbour as a whole system rather than individual parts. Movement becomes pattern. Pattern becomes control. The wind shifts, carrying a sharper scent of sea spray. Flags snap against tall masts. The sound echoes across water and stone. It feels less like nature interrupting human activity, and more like nature being incorporated into it, assigned a role within an expanding structure. You imagine the distant ports where these ships will arrive, tropical islands, crowded trading cities, coastal fortifications. Each location will be integrated into this system of exchange. Goods will flow in multiple directions, not randomly, but according to planned routes and financial expectations. A mainstream historical fact emerges again through observation of infrastructure. The Dutch East India Company maintained fortified trading posts across Asia to secure commercial routes and protect economic interests. You sense the dual nature of these places even before seeing them. They are both markets and strategic positions. The harbour begins to feel quieter as evening approaches. Shadows lengthen across wooden planks. Lanterns begin to glow softly, reflecting on water like scattered fragments of light. The intensity of daytime activity settles into slower rhythms. You stand for a moment at the edge of the quay. The sea stretches outward, calm but full of invisible pathways. The ships resting here are not idle. They are paused within a continuous cycle of movement that never truly stops. You realize that something fundamental has changed in how the world is being experienced. Travel is no longer just movement between places. It is participation in a system. Distance is no longer just physical. It is economic, political, and structured. As night deepens, the harbour does not sleep. It only shifts tone. Work continues in quieter forms. Records are updated, cargo secured, plans are refined. The world here feels like it is always preparing for the next motion, and you remain within it, standing between water and structure, between wind and calculation, between the older unpredictability of the sea and the emerging logic of global coordination. You move away from the highly ordered harbours of European trading powers, and the world becomes looser again, less centralised, more experimental. The rhythm of movement shifts. Instead of massive coordinated fleets and disciplined accounting systems, you now enter a landscape of early outposts, uncertain negotiations, and fragile beginnings. The sea is still present in your awareness, but it feels less controlled, more exploratory, as if the ocean itself is still resisting definition. The air is warmer here, humid and heavy, carrying the scent of unfamiliar spices, damp wood, and vegetation that feels almost too dense for European senses accustomed to colder climates. Birds cry out in distant, irregular patterns. Waves strike unevenly against shallow shores. You notice how sound behaves differently in this environment, less structured, more layered, harder to separate into clear patterns. You find yourself in the early world of English overseas expansion, where trading companies are still forming identity and function. These are not yet vast governing systems. They are fragile attempts to secure a place in global commerce already dominated by established competitors. Wooden buildings stand near coastlines, exposed to wind and weather, as if testing whether permanence is even possible here. A mainstream historical fact surfaces naturally through observation. The English East India Company was chartered in 1600 to pursue trade with Asia, especially in spices and textiles. You feel the significance of that moment not as a single event, but as a beginning of uncertainty. Nothing here is guaranteed. Everything is still being negotiated with distance, climate, and unfamiliar political landscapes. You walk through a small coastal settlement that serves as one of these early footholds. The ground is uneven, soft in places where rain has recently passed. Wooden posts mark boundaries that feel temporary rather than permanent. Storage buildings are simple, practical, and repeatedly repaired. The ocean is never far, you hear it constantly, like a background thought that never leaves. The smell is complex, salt and wood dominate, but beneath them are traces of spices already being handled, stored and traded. Pepper, ginger, and cinnamon arrive in small quantities, each one treated as valuable beyond its physical size. The air carries a subtle sweetness mixed with earth and moisture. It clings lightly to your skin. A quirky historical detail appears in the conversations of local traders. Some early English merchants believed that establishing small fortified posts in distant regions would naturally lead to friendly long-term alliances with local rulers simply through continuous presence. You sense how optimism shaped strategy in ways that often underestimated complexity. The world was not yet fully understood in its political depth. You continue deeper into the settlement. You notice how labour is organised differently here compared to the structured systems you observed earlier. Fewer formal divisions exist. Tasks overlap. Individuals perform multiple roles. A single person may handle storage, negotiation, and maintenance depending on immediate need. Flexibility replaces specialisation. The soundscape reflects this fluidity. Conversations overlap in multiple languages. Instructions are improvised rather than standardized. There is energy here, but it is uneven, sometimes efficient, sometimes chaotic. The system is still learning how to sustain itself. Scholars examining early English trading ventures often emphasize how fragile these initial networks were compared to later corporate structures. You feel that fragility in the environment itself. Buildings seem slightly temporary, as if they might be relocated if circumstances change. Nothing feels fully anchored yet. You approach a small administrative structure where records are being kept. Inside, the lighting is dim, filtered through thin wooden shutters. Papers are stacked unevenly. Ink stains appear on tables from repeated use. The act of writing here feels less formal than in European chambers of power, yet still essential. Information is the only thing that allows continuity across distance. A ledger is opened in front of you. Entries are inconsistent, sometimes detailed, sometimes sparse. Cargo descriptions vary depending on who recorded them. The system is still developing its own language. Yet even in this early form, you can see the beginning of global coordination emerging through repetition. Historians still debate whether these early English outposts were primarily commercial experiments or strategic footholds designed to gradually extend influence. That question lingers here without resolution. It exists in the uneven structure of the settlement itself, where trade and power are not yet clearly separated. You step outside again into the humid air. The sun is lower now, casting long shadows across wooden structures. Light reflects off damp surfaces, creating a soft glow that feels almost subdued rather than bright. The ocean remains constant in the background, its sound steady and unchanging. A group of workers unloads cargo from a small vessel. Their movements are coordinated but not rigid. Boxes are carried carefully, placed onto simple platforms, and sorted by type. Each action feels practical, immediate, driven by necessity rather than long-term planning. You notice how much depends on adaptation. Weather changes quickly here. Supply routes are unpredictable. Communication with Europe takes months. Every decision carries delay, and every response arrives long after conditions may have changed. A mainstream historical fact emerges gently through this environment. Early English trading posts in Asia often relied on negotiation with local rulers rather than direct military control during their initial phases. You sense how diplomacy and commerce overlap here in ways that are still being defined. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where the land meets water. The shoreline is irregular, shaped by tides and erosion rather than human design. Small boats rest in shallow water. Tied loosely to wooden posts, they move slightly with each wave, never fully still. The wind carries distant smells of land vegetation mixed with sea salt. It is a layered atmosphere, constantly shifting. You feel how this environment resists simplification. It cannot be reduced to a single system or structure. It remains dynamic. A quiet moment unfolds as you stand near the water. There is no formal activity here, only observation and waiting. The settlement continues behind you, but here the world feels less organized, more open-ended. Scholars still debate whether the success of early English overseas expansion depended more on adaptability in these uncertain environments or on later institutional support that transformed small outposts into larger systems. You sense both possibilities coexisting in this fragile stage. A final detail draws your attention. A small group gathers near a fire, speaking in low voices. The firelight flickers across their faces, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Their conversation blends practical concerns with distant speculation about future voyages, possible profits, and unknown territories still beyond reach. You listen without fully understanding every word. That is not necessary. What matters is the atmosphere of possibility. Nothing here is fixed. Everything is in motion, even when standing still. As night approaches, the settlement becomes quieter. The ocean remains audible, steady and patient. Lanterns begin to glow faintly, the wind softens. You remain near the shoreline, aware that this is only the beginning of a much larger unfolding system. Still forming, still uncertain, still learning how to exist. You move deeper into the expanding world of coastal trade, where early outposts gradually transform into structured settlements. The ocean is still present in every direction, but now it feels less like a vast unknown and more like a working corridor, a route repeatedly travelled, measured, and cautiously understood. The wind carries a steadier rhythm here, as if repetition itself is beginning to shape the environment. The settlement you enter is larger than before. Wooden structures are reinforced with stone foundations. Warehouses stand closer together, forming narrow passageways where goods are moved with growing efficiency. The ground is compacted from constant use, a mixture of soil, sand, and crushed shell. Every step you take produces a muted sound, softened by layers of accumulated activity. The air is thick with maritime influence. Salt is constant, but now mixed with the stronger presence of stored goods. Dried fish, textiles, timber, spices, and tar all blend into a complex atmosphere. You notice how smell becomes a map here, guiding you through spaces of storage, exchange, and labour. Even without seeing containers, you can sense what lies behind each wall. A mainstream historical fact becomes evident through the structure of the settlement itself. European trading companies established fortified coastal bases across Asia to secure shipping routes and ensure stable access to valuable goods. You do not need explanation for this. You can feel it in the architecture, in the placement of watch points, in the careful design of access routes between sea and land. You walk past a longer warehouse where workers are unloading goods in coordinated sequences. The movement is not fully rigid, but it is increasingly systematic. Cargo is sorted by type and destination. Records are updated immediately. Nothing is left untracked. The sound of wooden crates hitting the ground forms a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat of commerce. The ocean remains visible beyond the settlement walls. It is calmer than earlier harbours you visited, yet still unpredictable. Waves roll in with slow consistency. Ships anchored offshore sway gently, their masts forming a thin forest of vertical lines against the horizon. The sky above is pale, diffused with moisture and light cloud cover. A quirky historical detail surfaces from a conversation near a storage shed. Some early merchants believed that specific coastal winds carried beneficial qualities for preserving spices during transport. You hear this not as superstition alone, but as an attempt to make sense of environmental patterns through practical experience. Observation and belief often blended in ways that shape decision-making. You continue walking through the settlement. The paths become more organized. Wooden signs mark different areas for storage, administration, and repair. Workers move between zones with clearer purpose. The settlement is no longer just a temporary foothold. It is becoming a functioning system. Inside one of the administrative buildings, you find ledgers stacked in ordered piles. The room is cooler, shaded from direct sunlight. Ink pots are arranged neatly. Paper sheets are sorted by category. The act of record-keeping feels increasingly central to everything happening here. Without written structure, nothing can be sustained across the distances involved. A mainstream historical fact emerges through observation. European trading companies relied heavily on documentation systems to manage long-distance trade operations, ensuring that goods, profits, and obligations could be tracked across continents. You feel the importance of this in the careful repetition of writing, in the discipline required to maintain consistency over time. You observe a clerk copying entries from one ledger into another. The motion is steady and deliberate. Each number is checked twice. Each description is standardized as much as possible. Errors are corrected immediately. The room is quiet except for the scratch of ink and occasional turning of pages. Historians still debate whether the increasing bureaucratic nature of these trading systems was a necessary adaptation to global complexity or an early form of administrative control that reshaped entire regions. That question lingers in the background of everything you see here. It does not interrupt the flow of activity, it simply exists beneath it. Outside again, the settlement is busier as the day progresses. Labour is distributed across multiple coordinated zones. Repair work is done on ships, supplies are prepared for outgoing voyages, incoming goods are inspected and logged. The system feels like it is constantly in motion, yet never chaotic. You notice how communication has evolved. Signals, gestures, and brief verbal exchanges replace longer conversations. Efficiency is valued. Time spent on interpretation is minimized. Even uncertainty is managed through procedural steps rather than discussion. The wind strengthens slightly, carrying the scent of distant vegetation from inland regions. It mixes with sea air in a way that feels layered and complex. You become aware of how this environment is not simply coastal. It is a meeting point of multiple ecological zones, each influencing trade possibilities. A group of sailors prepares a smaller vessel near the shoreline. They check ropes, adjust sails, and secure cargo with practiced coordination. Their movements suggest familiarity with repeated routes. Though each journey still carries unknowns, the ocean is never fully controlled, only negotiated with. You stand near a stone platform overlooking the harbour. From here, you can see the settlement in full structure. Warehouses, docks, pathways, and ships form an interconnected system. It is no longer just a place, it is an operation. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through this overview. Fortified trading settlements often served both commercial and strategic purposes, enabling companies to maintain influence over maritime routes while facilitating trade. You see this dual function in the design of walls that are not just protective but also integrated into logistics. A quiet moment passes as you observe workers moving goods between storage areas. The repetition of their tasks creates a sense of rhythm. Nothing appears random. Everything is part of a larger cycle that continues regardless of individual attention. A faint sound of bells echoes from a central structure, signaling a transition in activity. Work shifts subtly. Some crews pause while others begin new tasks. The settlement adjusts like a living system responding to internal timing rather than external command. Scholars still examine how these early trading settlements balanced autonomy and dependency, especially in relation to both European sponsors and local political structures. You sense this tension physically in the settlement's layout. It is neither fully independent nor fully controlled from afar. As evening approaches, light softens across wooden surfaces, shadows lengthen through narrow passages, lanterns are prepared and gradually lit, casting warm illumination over stone and timber. The harbour becomes quieter, but not inactive. Work continues in reduced intensity. You walk toward the edge of the settlement again. The ocean is darker now, reflecting fading light in broken patterns. Ships appear as silhouettes against the horizon. The wind is gentler, carrying the sound of water in long, continuous motion. Everything here feels stabilized compared to earlier stages, yet still provisional. The system is stronger, more coordinated, but still dependent on distance, weather, and human negotiation. Nothing is fully permanent. You remain at the shoreline for a moment longer, watching the water move without interruption. It does not hurry, it does not pause, it simply continues, as it always has, carrying within it the roots, risks, and possibilities of everything that has been built along its edges. You move away from the structured coastal settlements and into a quieter, but far more intense landscape of Wolu. The air feels different immediately. It is warmer, almost saturated with moisture, carrying the scent of dense vegetation, flowering plants, and earth that has never fully dried. The ocean is still nearby, but it is no longer the centre of attention. Instead, islands emerge as the focal points of human desire and conflict. You find yourself in a region scattered with small landmasses, where every grove of trees and every patch of soil seems to hold economic significance. The environment is lush beyond European familiarity. Forests are thick, layered, almost overwhelming in their density. The sounds are constant. Insects hum in steady waves. Birds call from hidden branches. The wind moves through leaves in uneven rhythms that never fully settle into silence. A mainstream historical fact becomes clear through the structure of activity around certain islands in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Maluku region, were historically central to the global spice trade due to their unique production of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. You feel this importance not as distant knowledge, but as physical presence in the air itself. The scent is sharp, warm, almost intoxicating. You walk along a narrow path carved through vegetation. The ground is uneven, soft in places where roots and moisture have reshaped it. Small settlements appear intermittently, built close to cultivation zones. These are not large cities. They are concentrated points of production and exchange, shaped entirely by the value of what grows around them. A quirky historical detail emerges through observation of local trade practices. In some regions, spice quantities were once measured using highly localized units that varied between islands, sometimes even between villages. You notice how this lack of standardization created opportunities for negotiation, misunderstanding, and sometimes deliberate manipulation in exchange system. The atmosphere is dense, both physically and economically. Every movement of goods carries weight far beyond its physical form. A small bag of cloves can represent months of labour, negotiation, and transport. You begin to understand how value here is not abstract. It is deeply tied to geography, scarcity, and control of access. You approach a trading post near the coast. Wooden structures stand slightly raised above the damp ground. Roofs are made from layered plant materials designed to withstand heavy rain. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires nearby. The sound of waves is present but muted by forest and terrain. Inside the trading area, activity is focused and quiet. Goods are inspected carefully. Spices are weighed using small balances. Cloth is exchanged for bundles of dried plant material. Every transaction feels precise, almost ceremonial. There is little excess movement. Everything is directed toward completion. You notice how European presence integrates into this environment without fully dominating it. Small fortified posts stand near local settlements. They are functional rather than grand. Their purpose is control of exchange points, not large-scale occupation. This creates a layered system of interaction, where multiple groups participate in the same trade network but with different levels of influence. A mainstream historical fact appears through this landscape of the exchange control over spice-producing regions was a central objective of several European trading companies, as these commodities held extraordinary value in European markets due to limited supply and high demand. You feel that imbalance here. It is not stated. It is embedded in every transaction. You walk deeper into the island environment. The air becomes even more humid. The sound of water appears frequently in small forms. Streams, puddles, and rainfall channels intersect the path. The ground occasionally gives way underfoot, forcing careful movement. The environment feels alive in a constant state of growth and decay. A group of local cultivators works near spice trees. Their movements are deliberate and repetitive. Harvesting is done with care, ensuring that trees remain productive over time. You observe how knowledge of cultivation is deeply embedded in routine practice rather than written instruction. It is lived experience passed through repetition. A reflective observation arises here without formal structure. Some early European traders assumed that controlling trade routes alone would be enough to dominate spice production. Yet the reality is more complex. Cultivation, local knowledge, and ecological sensitivity all play crucial roles that cannot be easily replaced by distant control. Scholars examining early global trade systems often emphasize the ecological dimension of commerce, noting how environmental conditions shaped economic power as much as political strategy. You sense this clearly in the way the island itself dictates movement, productivity, and even negotiation. You continue toward a higher point in the landscape where visibility expands. From here, you can see patches of cultivated land breaking through forest cover. Smoke rises from multiple locations. Small boats move along coastal edges. The island's not isolated. It is part of a wider network of movement and exchange. A subtle but important realization forms. These islands are not simply sources of goods. They are nodes within a global system being constructed through repeated voyages, negotiations, and conflicts. The ocean connects them, but also separates them. Distance is both barrier and bridge. A quieter historical detail appears in local conversation. Some communities believe that certain harvesting times, influenced by lunar cycles and seasonal winds, produced higher quality spices. You hear this as part of environmental observation rather than superstition. It reflects careful attention to natural variation. The settlement near the coast grows busier as ships arrive. Cargo is unloaded in organized sequences. Spices are packed into containers designed for long-distance travel. The smell intensifies as storage areas fill. It is warm, sharp, and almost overwhelming in enclosed spaces. You notice the interaction between different groups. Traders, sailors, cultivators, and local authorities all operate within overlapping systems. Communication is functional, often limited to essential exchanges. Yet despite linguistic and cultural differences, trade continues smoothly through repeated patterns of interaction. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through this process. European trading companies often relied on alliances with local rulers and communities to secure access to spice-producing regions, rather than direct control alone in early phases. You see the balance in shared spaces where authority is negotiated rather than imposed outright. You stand near the edge of the settlement where forest meets sea. The contrast is sharp. One side is dense, humid, and layered with life. The other is open, vast, and unpredictable. Ships anchored offshore appear small against the scale of water and sky. The wind carries mixed scents of salt and vegetation. It moves continuously between land and sea, never fully belonging to either. You feel how this movement mirrors the trade itself, constantly shifting between sources and destinations, production and consumption. As daylight begins to soften, activity slows but does not stop. Goods are still being sorted. Conversations continue in lower tones. Fires are lit for cooking and light. The island settles into evening rhythm, yet remains connected to distant markets through ships that will depart when conditions allow. You remain there for a moment, observing how a small island environment becomes a critical point in a vast global system. Nothing here is isolated. Every tree, every harbour, every shipment is part of a network stretching far beyond sight. The ocean remains in the background, steady and patient, carrying within it the roots that connect these concentrated landscapes of value to distant cities that depend on them more than they realise. You leave the Spice Islands behind, and the air changes again as if the world itself is rebalancing its priorities. The dense humidity fades slightly, replaced by a wider, more breathable atmosphere shaped by river valleys, monsoon winds, and vast agricultural plains. The ocean is still present in the background of history, but here it is rivers and land routes that begin to dominate movement. Everything feels more expansive, less concentrated, yet no less intense. You find yourself moving inland, where textile production becomes the centre of economic life. Fields stretch outward in long, irregular patterns. Cotton plants sway gently under warm wind, their white fibres catching sunlight like scattered fragments of cloud. Villages appear frequently, each one connected to the rhythm of cultivation, spinning and weaving. A mainstream historical fact becomes evident through the scale of activity around you. The Indian subcontinent was one of the most important global centres of cotton textile production during the early modern period, supplying finely crafted fabrics to regional and international markets. You feel this significance not as abstraction, but as texture in the air, as the visual density of woven cloth hanging in rows to dry. You walk through a weaving settlement where production is deeply integrated into daily life. The sound of hand looms fills the space in steady, rhythmic cycles. Wood frames creak softly as threads are pulled tight. Each motion is repeated with practiced precision. The sound is not loud, but it is constant, like a pulse distributed across many homes and workshops. The smell here is different from the Spice Islands. It is cleaner, more grounded. Fresh fibres, natural dyes, and sun-dried fabric create an atmosphere that feels warm but not overwhelming. Occasionally, smoke from dyeing processes drifts through the air, carrying faint earthy tones mixed with plant-based pigments. You observe artisans working with careful attention. Hands move quickly but not carelessly. Patterns emerge gradually from repeated motion. Designs are not just decorative, they carry cultural meaning, regional identity, and technical mastery developed over generations. Every piece of cloth contains time compressed into structure. A quieter historical observation appears through local practice in some regions. Dye recipes and weaving techniques were traditionally passed down within families and guild-like communities, making textile knowledge both an economic resource and a protected form of cultural inheritance. You sense how skill itself becomes a kind of capital here, invisible but powerful. You continue walking through interconnected villages where production and daily life overlap. Homes are not separated from workspaces. Courtyards function as both living areas and production zones. Children move through these spaces naturally, observing patterns of labour that will later become their own. A mainstream historical fact becomes clear. Through trade routes, Indian textiles were highly sought after across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe due to their quality, durability, and intricate designs. You notice how demand is reflected in the scale of production. It is not just local consumption, It is global anticipation shaping local labour. You approach a larger market area where finished fabrics are displayed. Rolls of cloth hang from wooden frames, their colours vibrant under daylight: indigo blues, deep reds, earthy browns, and bright yellows create a layered visual field. The movement of fabric in the wind gives the market a living quality, as if it is breathing colour. Buyers move slowly through the space. Some examine texture carefully by touch. Others inspect dye consistency or stitching detail. Negotiations are quiet but continuous. Prices are not fixed in isolation. They shift depending on quality, origin, and seasonal availability. You notice how language becomes secondary here. Communication happens through gestures, samples, and repeated transactions. Trust is built through familiarity rather than formal documentation. Yet beneath this informal surface, a highly sophisticated system of production and exchange operates with remarkable stability. A quirky historical detail emerges in conversation near a dye workshop. Some textile producers once believed that certain natural dyes improved in colour intensity depending on the water source used during preparation. Whether fully accurate or not, this belief reflects careful observation of environmental variation in craft processes. You step into a shaded workspace where dyeing is performed. Large vats contain liquids in varying shades of deep colour. Fabric is submerged, lifted, and hung to dry in cycles. The smell here is stronger, a mix of plant materials, minerals, and heat. Steam rises gently, diffusing light into soft patterns. Scholars examining early global trade often emphasize the central role of textiles in shaping long-distance commerce, particularly because cloth served both functional and cultural purposes across multiple regions. You feel this importance in the density of production, in how deeply it is embedded in everyday life. You walk along a narrow path between fields and workshops. The landscape feels continuous, with no sharp separation between agriculture and manufacturing. Cotton grows nearby, is processed in villages, spun into thread, and woven into fabric within relatively short distances. The entire cycle exists within visible reach. A reflective observation forms naturally here. Unlike the Spice Islands, where value is concentrated in limited ecological zones, textile production spreads across wide regions, distributed through many small centres of skill and labour. This creates a different kind of economic structure, less dependent on singular scarcity and more on sustained human expertise. You approach a river, crossing where fabric is being transported. Bundles of cloth are stacked carefully on carts and small boats. The river moves slowly but steadily, carrying goods toward larger trading hubs. Water reflects the sky in fragmented patterns, broken by movement and current. A mainstream historical fact appears through infrastructure. Inland waterways played a crucial role in connecting textile production regions to major ports, enabling efficient movement of goods across the subcontinent. You observe this system in motion, not as theory, but as coordinated movement of labour, transport, and timing. The sound of the river blends with the distant loom activity, creating a layered auditory environment. It is neither quiet nor chaotic. It is structured in waves, with moments of intensity followed by softer intervals. You pause near the riverbank. The water carries small fragments of plant material downstream. Occasional ripples distort reflections of trees and sky. The scene feels balanced between stillness and motion, as if the landscape itself is participating in exchange. Historians still debate whether the global demand for Indian textiles strengthened local economies through sustained trade or contributed to long-term structural shifts that later made regions more vulnerable to external control. That tension remains present in the flow of goods you see moving along the river. As evening approaches, the weaving villages begin to slow. Loom sounds become less frequent. Fires are lit for cooking. Fabric is hung to dry overnight. The air cools slightly, carrying the scent of damp cloth and earth. You stand at the edge of the settlement, watching the river continue its steady movement. It does not change direction. It does not pause. It simply carries what has been placed into it, linking production to distant destinations that remain unseen but deeply connected. In this landscape of cloth, thread, and labour, you begin to understand how global systems are not built only on rare spices or distant voyages, but also on continuous, patient human work repeated across generations. You leave the weaving villages and river networks behind, and the landscape begins to quiet in a different way. The sounds of looms and flowing water gradually fade, replaced by a softer rhythm of distant trade routes and domestic life. The air feels cooler now, less saturated with humidity, carrying faint traces of dried leaves, wood smoke, and the subtle bitterness of steeped herbs that drift through homes and marketplaces. You enter a world where a single plant begins to carry extraordinary cultural weight. Tea appears not as a luxury at first, but as a slowly spreading habit, moving through households, monasteries, and trading corridors. The environment is calm, structured around daily routines that feel both intimate and expansive at the same time. A mainstream historical fact becomes clear through observation of daily practice. Tea cultivation and consumption originated in China and gradually spread across Asia and later into global trade networks, becoming one of the most widely consumed beverages in the world. You feel this not as a distant fact, but as a quiet transformation of everyday life, where simple leaves become a connector between regions and generations. You walk through a hillside landscape where tea plants grow in carefully maintained rows. The slopes are gentle but persistent, shaped by human effort over long periods. Mist drifts through the fields in slow layers, softening edges and muting colours. The air is fresh, slightly vegetal, carrying the faint aroma of crushed leaves and moist soil. Workers move carefully between plants, plucking leaves with practiced precision. Their movements are calm, repetitive, almost meditative. Each leaf is selected by touch and sight, guided by experience rather than instruction. Baskets slowly fill with fresh harvests, their green tones bright against the muted landscape. The soundscape here is subtle. Wind through leaves, soft footsteps on soil, occasional distant voices exchanged in low tones. There is no urgency. The rhythm is steady, as if time itself has slowed to match the pace of cultivation. A quieter historical observation emerges through local tradition. In some regions, tea preparation was not only a domestic activity but also a ceremonial one, integrated into social rituals, hospitality customs, and moments of reflection. You sense how the act of preparing tea becomes a form of structured pause within daily life. You continue along a narrow path leading toward a small settlement nestled between hills. Wooden houses with curved roofs sit close together, designed to withstand seasonal weather patterns. Smoke rises gently from hearths where water is being heated. The smell of boiling leaves begins to drift through the air, warm and slightly earthy. Inside one of the homes, you observe the preparation process. Water is poured carefully over dried leaves. The sound is soft, almost imperceptible. A quiet meeting of elements. Steam rises in thin streams, carrying aroma into the room. People sit in stillness, waiting for the infusion to settle. A mainstream historical fact becomes evident through this cultural setting. Tea evolved from medicinal use into a daily beverage deeply integrated into social and cultural practices across East Asia, eventually influencing global consumption habits through trade expansion. You feel this transition not as sudden change, but as gradual embedding into human routine. You step outside again into the hillside air. The mist has thickened slightly, softening visibility. Distant fields appear and disappear through shifting layers of fog. The world feels gently fragmented, as if it is being revealed in stages rather than all at once. A quirky historical detail appears through local belief systems. Some early tea drinkers believed that the clarity of the water used in preparation could influence not only flavour, but also emotional balance and mental focus, whether symbolic or practical. This reflects a close attention to environmental conditions in everyday life. You walk further along the hillside where small paths connect scattered communities. These routes are narrow but well used, shaped by a repeated movement over time. Along the way, you notice small shrines, resting points, and gathering spaces where travellers pause briefly before continuing their journeys. The sound of distant markets begins to emerge as you approach a larger settlement. Unlike earlier textile hubs or spice ports, this environment feels quieter, more reflective. Commerce exists here, but it is embedded within daily life rather than dominating it. Tea houses appear along the streets, simple wooden structures with open fronts. Inside, people sit in calm conversation or quiet solitude. Cups are small, handled with care. The atmosphere is steady, unhurried. Even conversation seems to follow a gentle rhythm. Scholars examining the spread of tea culture often highlight how it functioned not only as a commodity, but also as a medium of social interaction, shaping communication patterns, hospitality norms, and even philosophical reflection. You sense this clearly in the way space is organized around pause and attention. You enter one of these tea houses. The interior is modest: wooden tables, ceramic cups, shelves of dried leaves. Light filters through paper screens, creating soft patterns on the floor. The sound inside is minimal: occasional pouring of water, quiet footsteps, brief exchanges of words. A cup is placed in front of you. The liquid is warm, lightly coloured, carrying a subtle aroma that is both calming and complex. You hold it for a moment before drinking. The sensation is gentle, slightly bitter at first, then smooth as it settles. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through cultural diffusion. Tea drinking practices spread from East Asia into Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe through expanding trade networks, adapting to different cultural contexts along the way. You can almost trace this movement in imagination, as if each cup carries a memory of distance travelled. Outside the tea house, the settlement continues its quiet activity. People move slowly through streets. Small markets sell dried goods, ceramics, and textiles. The pace is consistent, neither rushed nor stagnant. It feels balanced between production and reflection. You notice how tea functions here not just as a product but as a social anchor. Meetings are held over it. Conversations begin and end with it. Moments of pause are structured around its preparation. It becomes a shared rhythm embedded in daily life. A reflective observation forms naturally here. Unlike spices that concentrate value in scarcity, or textiles that rely on distributed production, tea operates through repetition and accessibility. Its significance grows not from rarity, but from continuity. Historians still debate whether the global rise of tea consumption was driven more by cultural adaptation or by trade systems that amplified its availability across regions. That question lingers quietly in the background of this landscape, unresolved but ever present. As evening approaches, the hillside becomes more muted. Mist thickens again, softening edges of buildings and fields. Tea houses glow warmly from within. Smoke rises gently into cooling air. The world feels slower, more contained, as if wrapped in a soft layer of stillness. You remain for a moment at the edge of the settlement, holding the quiet warmth of the day. The landscape does not demand attention. It simply exists, steady and continuous, shaped by cycles of cultivation, preparation, and shared presence. The idea of tea lingers in the air around you, not as a product of trade alone, but as a rhythm of life that connects distant regions through small repeated acts of attention and care. You leave the quiet tea hills behind, and the atmosphere shifts into something heavier, more politically charged, as if the air itself carries the residue of global imbalance. The landscape opens into wider trade corridors again, where movement is constant but increasingly burdened by tension. The rhythm of exchange is no longer gentle or reflective. It feels pressured, shaped by demand that stretches across continents. You find yourself moving through a network of ports and inland routes where goods no longer travel in isolation. Everything is connected now through layered systems of obligation, extraction, and return. The ocean is still present in the background, but it no longer feels like a neutral space. It feels like a channel through which power is continuously negotiated. The air here is mixed with unfamiliar density. Salt from coastal winds blends with metallic undertones of coinage, storage, and long-distance transport. There is also a faint bitterness, almost chemical in sensation, that seems to cling to conversations rather than objects. You notice how people speak more cautiously in this environment, as if words themselves carry economic weight. A core historical reality becomes apparent through observation of trade patterns. Global commerce in the early modern period increasingly involved the exchange of silver, spices, textiles, and other high-value commodities across interconnected routes linking Asia, Europe, and the Americas. You sense this not as abstraction, but as imbalance made visible in movement itself. You walk through a port where silver shipments arrive in tightly secured containers. The metal is heavy, almost silent in its presence. It does not smell, yet its influence feels pervasive. It is handled with care that borders on reverence. Every transfer is recorded, weighed, and sealed under supervision. Nearby, other goods are prepared for outbound journeys. Spices are packed in layers of protective material. Textiles are folded with precision. Each category of cargo carries its own logic of value and risk. The entire system feels like a complex equation being continuously balanced across distance. A quieter historical observation surfaces in conversation between merchants. Some believe that silver carried not just monetary value but symbolic stability, acting as a universal medium that could anchor otherwise uncertain exchanges between vastly different economies. You hear this idea not as fact or myth, but as an attempt to explain consistency in an unstable system. You continue through a series of storage halls where goods from multiple regions converge. The smell is layered and intense. Dried plant materials, processed metals, woven fabrics, and preserved food all exist within the same enclosed spaces. The air feels dense with accumulation, as if the world has been compressed into manageable units. The soundscape here is mechanical in rhythm. Crates are lifted and set down with repetitive force. Wheels creak under weight. Paper is shuffled constantly. Voices call out measurements, destinations, and conditions. Everything is tracked. Everything is accounted for. A subtle historical reality becomes visible through structure rather than statement. The expansion of global trade networks created increasingly interdependent systems where distant regions influenced each other's economies through supply and demand cycles that spanned oceans. You feel this interdependence in every movement of goods around you. You step outside the storage hall into brighter air. The sun is lower now, casting long reflections across dock surfaces. Ships line the harbour in dense formation, some preparing for departure, others arriving after long voyages. The water is restless but controlled, framed by human construction. You notice how the harbour functions less as a destination and more as a transition point. Nothing here stays permanently. Everything moves through. Goods arrive, are processed, and leave again in different forms. The port itself is not static. It is a transformation space. A quieter detail emerges from the behaviour of workers. Many of them move with familiarity across multiple roles. Loading, inspection, record-keeping, and coordination often overlap. This flexibility reflects the adaptive nature of labor in environments where demand fluctuates across global routes. You approach a raised platform overlooking the entire harbour system from here. The scale becomes more visible. Warehouses, docks, ships, and administrative buildings form a coordinated structure that extends both outward into the sea and inward into land-based networks. A historical observation becomes clear through this vantage point. Early global trade systems relied heavily on port cities as central nodes that connected regional economies into wider commercial networks. You can see this clearly in how every structure here serves a specific function within a larger cycle. The wind strengthens slightly, moving across the harbour in steady waves. It carries salt, wood, smoke, and distant spices all at once. Flags attached to masts snap and relax in repeating cycles. The sound echoes across water and stone, blending with human activity below. You notice how movement here is never isolated. A ship arriving triggers inspection, documentation, and redistribution. A ship departing triggers preparation, calculation, and anticipation. Each action sets off a chain reaction that extends far beyond immediate visibility. A reflective observation forms as you watch this system operate. Value in this world is not static, it moves constantly. Shaped by geography, timing, and political control, even absence becomes part of the system, as delay or disruption alters entire sequences of exchange. In a quieter corner of the harbour, you see smaller boats being loaded for coastal transport. These vessels connect larger ports to inland routes, forming a secondary layer of circulation. They are less visible, but essential to maintaining continuity across regions. A subtle historical reality emerges through this layered system. Global trade was not only sustained by major transoceanic voyages, but also by extensive regional networks that distributed goods locally and maintained flow between major hubs. You feel this complexity in the constant movement of smaller vessels around the harbour. As evening approaches, light softens across the entire landscape. The water reflects fading tones of gold and grey. Activity slows slightly, but does not stop. Lamps are lit across warehouses and ships. The harbour transitions into a different phase of operation. You remain near the edge of the platform, observing how everything continues to move even as visibility decreases. The system does not depend on daylight. It depends on continuity. Work shifts, but does not cease. A final reflection emerges as you stand there. The ocean, which once felt like vast emptiness, now appears as a structured medium of connection. It carries not only goods, but systems of value, power, and dependence that span continents. And within this realization, you sense how deeply intertwined distant regions have become, not through proximity, but through repetition and exchange, and the quiet persistence of movement across water. You leave the layered port systems behind, and the world shifts once again. But this time the change is not geographic. It is structural. You are no longer moving through trade routes or coastal settlements. Instead, you are entering a place where commerce begins to transform into authority itself. The air feels heavier, not with humidity or salt, but with consequence. Every decision here seems to echo farther than the room in which it is made. You find yourself in Bengal, a region where fertile land meets dense river systems and long-established local economies. The landscape is rich and complex. Wide rivers branch like veins across flat terrain. Villages sit near water edges, surrounded by fields that stretch toward the horizon. Boats move constantly along these waterways, carrying grain, cloth, and people in a steady rhythm shaped by seasons and monsoon cycles. The air is warm and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth, rice fields, and slow-moving water. Birds move in large groups above the riverbanks, their calls blending into distant human activity. The environment feels alive in layers, with agriculture, trade, and daily life deeply intertwined. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through the organisation of space and activity in the mid-18th century. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the English East India Company gained significant political and economic control over Bengal. You feel this shift not as a single moment, but as a gradual reorientation of power embedded into land, taxation, and administration. You walk through a riverside settlement where administrative presence is becoming more visible. Buildings used for record keeping and supervision stand alongside older local structures. The contrast is subtle but persistent. New systems are not replacing old ones immediately, they are layering over them. The soundscape here is quieter than the harbours you visited earlier. Instead of constant shipbuilding noise, you hear river currents, distant market activity, and occasional calls from traders along the water. There is a steady sense of movement, but it is more inland, more administrative, less oceanic. Inside a modest office near the river, clerks sit at wooden tables covered with papers. Ink pots are arranged in careful order. Ledgers record land revenue, production output, and trade flow. The act of writing here carries weight beyond commerce. It becomes a mechanism of governance. A quiet historical observation emerges through daily practice. Local systems of taxation and land management were gradually adapted and recorded into structured administrative frameworks introduced by the East India Company, creating new layers of financial obligation tied directly to agricultural output. You sense how writing becomes a tool that shapes land use itself. You step outside into the settlement again. Farmers move along paths carrying bundles of crops. Small market stalls operate near river crossings. Goods are exchanged in familiar ways. But now there is an additional presence of overheat. Measurement becomes more standardized. Transactions are more frequently recorded. A subtle cultural detail appears in conversation among villagers. Some recall older systems of seasonal tax collection and flexible local arrangements, contrasting them with newer fixed demands tied to documented output. You hear this not as complaint or judgment, but as memory interacting with change. You continue walking toward the river where boats are being loaded. The water is wide and slow-moving, reflecting the sky in broken patterns. Cargoes organised carefully before being placed onto vessels. Rice, indigo, textiles, and other agricultural products are bundled in standardised forms. A mainstream historical fact becomes apparent through observation. Bengal's agricultural and textile productivity made it one of the most economically significant regions under company control, shaping global trade flows in textiles and raw materials. You feel this importance in the density of activity along the river. The wind here is soft but constant. It moves across fields and water without interruption. The sound of oars dipping into the river creates a slow rhythm that blends with distant voices and animal movement. Everything feels coordinated by natural cycles, even as administrative systems overlay themselves onto it. You approach a larger administrative compound where local officials and company representatives interact. The building is functional, not grand. Its purpose is clarity of record and enforcement of procedure. Inside, maps of land holdings are spread across tables. Boundaries are marked with ink and measurement notes. A quieter historical reflection emerges in this space. Control over revenue collection gradually shifted economic relationships between land, labour, and governance, altering traditional structures of agricultural production. You sense how deeply this system depends on documentation and classification. You observe a clerk explaining figures to a local landholder. Their conversation is measured, careful, mediated through written records. Numbers are not just descriptions, they define obligations. The atmosphere is tense but controlled, shaped by procedure rather than force. Outside again, you notice how the river functions as both connection and boundary. It carries goods outwards toward coastal ports, linking inland production to global trade systems. At the same time, it separates regions, creating natural divisions that influence administrative organisation. A subtle historical detail appears in the behaviour of river traders. Many maintain long-established family routes and seasonal schedules, adapting to new administrative systems while preserving older patterns of movement. You see continuity and change existing side by side. You continue along the riverbank as afternoon light begins to soften. The water reflects shifting tones of gold and grey. Boats move steadily, neither hurried nor idle. The landscape feels balance between natural rhythm and structured intervention. A mainstream historical fact becomes clear through this layered environment. The East India Company gradually transitioned from a trading organisation into a governing authority in parts of India, administering revenue collection and influencing local political structures. You feel this transformation not as abrupt takeover, but as gradual integration into existing systems. A quiet moment unfolds near the river. A group of workers rests briefly under a shaded structure. Conversations are low, focused on daily tasks, seasonal changes, and river conditions. Life continues with resilience, adapting to shifting systems above it. Scholars still examine how this transition affected long-term economic patterns in the region, particularly the relationship between agricultural productivity and administrative demands. You sense this complexity in the coexistence of abundance and regulation. As evening approaches, the settlement becomes quieter. Lamps are lit near administrative buildings. River traffic slows but does not stop. The water continues its steady movement, unaffected by human systems layered upon it. You stand at the river's edge, observing how deeply interconnected this landscape has become. Agriculture, administration, and trade are no longer separate domains. They form a continuous structure extending from fields to rivers to distant oceans. And within that structure, you see how a company that once traded goods has begun to shape the very conditions under which those goods are produced. You leave the river and administration of Bengal behind, and the atmosphere shifts into something denser, more uncertain, as if the ground beneath history itself has become less stable. The river sounds fade gradually, replaced by distant echoes of political tension, military movement, and uneasy alliances forming and dissolving in quick succession. The air feels drier here, carrying dust from roads and camps rather than moisture from water and fields. You find yourself approaching a landscape marked by sudden change. Villages appear intact but quieter, as if anticipating events rather than actively participating in them. Roads are more heavily used, filled with movement that is less about trade and more about positioning. The rhythm of life has altered. There is still agriculture, still labour, but it is now surrounded by an undercurrent of strategic calculation. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through the structure of movement around you. The Battle of Plassey in 1757 marked a decisive turning point in which the English East India Company established significant political and economic influence in Bengal, all following its victory over the Nawab and his allies. You sense this not as a single battlefield moment, but as a shift that continues to ripple through every layer of daily life. You walk along a dusty road where military camps and administrative posts exist in uneasy proximity. Soldiers move in measured formations, their presence structured but not chaotic. The sound of marching feet blends with the creaking of wagons and distant animal calls. Everything feels organised, yet tense, as if order is being actively maintained rather than naturally present. The air carries a mix of heat, dust, and faint smoke from cooking fires. The smell is dry and persistent, clinging to clothing and skin. You notice how visibility changes with movement. Dust rises from passing groups and lingers in the air before slowly settling back onto the ground. A quieter historical observation emerges through the landscape itself. The aftermath of Plassey did not immediately transform daily life everywhere, but it gradually altered political authority. creating overlapping systems of control where local governance and company influence coexisted in complex arrangements. You sense this overlap in every interaction between officials and local inhabitants. You continue toward a fortified encampment near a strategic location. The structure is functional, built for control and coordination rather than permanence. Wooden palisades, earthen walls, and guarded entry points define its boundaries. Inside, movement is organized but not rigid. Messages are carried between stations. Orders are issued and adjusted based on changing conditions. The soundscape here is layered. Drums signal timing. Horses move through designated paths. Conversations are brief and purposeful. Even silence feels structured, as if it is part of operational discipline. A subtle historical detail appears in the behavior of officers and local intermediaries. Communication often relied on negotiation, translation, and adaptation between different administrative traditions. This created a system where decisions were shaped not only by authority, but also by interpretation and context. You observe a meeting taking place under a shaded canopy. Maps are spread across a table, edges held down by small weights. Markers indicate locations of settlements, supply routes, and strategic positions. Fingers trace paths across terrain, linking geography with intention. A mainstream historical fact becomes evident through this setting. Military and administrative authority increasingly overlapped with commercial interests during the expansion of the East India Company's influence in India. You feel this overlap in the blending of trade logistics and territorial control within the same operational spaces. You step away from the meeting area and move toward the edge of the encampment. Beyond it, the land stretches outward into fields and scattered settlements. Life continues beyond the fortified space, but it now exists in proximity to structured power. The boundary between civilian and strategic space feels thinner than before. A quieter cultural detail emerges from nearby interactions. Local inhabitants continue daily routines such as farming, market exchange, and craftsmanship, but now do so under changing administrative expectations. Adaptation becomes part of survival, not through abrupt transformation, but through gradual adjustment. You walk further along the edge of controlled territory. The land is open, yet it feels mapped in invisible ways. Movement is not restricted physically in all areas, but it is increasingly observed, recorded, and influenced by external systems of authority. A reflective observation forms here. The shift you are witnessing is not only military or political, it is structural. Systems of governance and commerce are merging, creating a new form of organization where economic activity and territorial control reinforce each other. Scholars examining this period often highlight how such transitions blurred the distinction between company and state, especially in regions where administrative authority expanded through economic leverage. You sense this ambiguity in every formal document, every mapped boundary, every coordinated movement. You pass by a supply station where goods are being distributed to different units. The process is orderly. Items are counted, recorded, and assigned according to requirement. Even here, commerce and logistics remain deeply intertwined with governance and strategy. The wind picks up slightly, carrying dust across open ground. It moves through tents, ropes, and equipment, shifting their positions subtly. The environment feels unsettled, not chaotic, but continuously adjusted. A quieter historical observation appears in conversation among local guides and interpreters working with administrative forces. Many express familiarity with multiple systems of authority, having adapted over time to changing rulers and organizational structures. Their experience reflects continuity beneath visible disruption. You continue toward a rise in the terrain where visibility expands. From here, you can see both the encampment and the surrounding settlements. The contrast is clear. One side is structured, controlled, and strategic. The other is distributed, agricultural, and traditional. Yet they are now interconnected through overlapping influence. A mainstream historical fact becomes visible through this panorama after key military victories. The East India Company expanded its role beyond trade into revenue collection and territorial administration in several regions. You see this expansion not as sudden domination, but as layered integration into existing systems. As the sun lowers, shadows lengthen across fields and camps alike. Activity continues, but intensity decreases slightly. Fires are lit, guards rotate positions, administrative work continues indoors under dim light. You remain on the rise for a moment longer, observing how the landscape holds multiple realities at once: agriculture, military organization, trade systems, and local life all coexist within a single evolving structure. And within that structure, you sense how deeply a commercial enterprise has begun to reshape not only exchange, but governance itself, extending its influence across both land and life in ways that continue to unfold. You leave behind the military administrative landscape of rising power and enter a quieter but more pervasive environment, where control no longer feels concentrated in camps or councils, but diffused into everyday life. The terrain is no longer defined by visible authority alone. Instead, it is shaped by systems that operate through routine, documentation, and economic obligation. The air feels calmer here, but it carries a subtle weight, as if unseen structures are embedded within it. You find yourself moving through villages and agricultural zones that appear peaceful at first glance. Fields stretch outward in broad, carefully tended patterns. Farmers work with steady repetition, their movements shaped by seasonal cycles that have governed life here for generations. Yet beneath this continuity, something has shifted. The rhythm of production is now connected to external systems of assessment and demand. The smell of wet soil, harvested grain, and wood smoke fills the air. Rivers and irrigation channels cut through the landscape, guiding water with practiced precision. Birds move low across fields, occasionally scattering as people pass. Life appears stable, but there is a sense that stability is now measured, recorded, and evaluated from elsewhere. You walk along a path connecting several settlements. Along the way, small stations appear where goods are weighed, recorded, or temporarily stored. The presence of written records has become more frequent. Paper is no longer confined to administrative centres, it now appears in rural exchanges, marking obligations tied to land and harvest. A historical reality becomes clear through observation rather than announcement. Systems of revenue collection introduced under company administration increasingly tied agricultural production to fixed assessments, requiring documentation of land output and structured payment obligations. You feel this in the way farmers interact with record keepers, in the careful attention given to measurement, and in the quiet seriousness of each transaction. Inside a village structure used for administrative record keeping, the air is still and slightly dim. Wooden tables are covered with papers and ink stains. Officials sit with focused attention, copying figures from one document to another. The sound of writing is steady, almost continuous, broken only by brief exchanges of clarification. You observe a farmer presenting information about land and yield. The interaction is formal but not distant. It carries the weight of familiarity mixed with adjustment. Language is precise. Numbers are checked and rechecked. Each entry becomes part of a larger system that extends far beyond the village itself. A subtle observation emerges through this process. Traditional forms of flexible local arrangements are gradually replaced or absorbed into structured documentation. This does not happen abruptly. It occurs through repetition, through small administrative adjustments that accumulate over time. You step outside again into the open air. The sun is higher now, casting clear light across fields and pathways. Movement continues steadily. People carry tools, bundles of grain, and household goods between locations. The village is active, but its activity is increasingly connected to broader systems of governance and trade. You continue towards a larger agricultural zone where production is more intensive. Fields here are organized with careful spacing. Crops grow in dense, uniform patterns. The landscape feels productive but also managed, as if shaped not only by environment but by expectation. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through the structure of land use. Agricultural productivity in this region became closely linked to administrative systems that required predictable output for taxation and trade purposes. You sense how deeply this connection influences daily decisions, from planting cycles to labor distribution. Near the edge of a field, you notice workers resting briefly under shade. Their conversation is low and practical, focused on weather, soil conditions, and transport schedules. Even rest feels structured by necessity. Time is divided not only by nature but by obligation. A quieter cultural detail appears in the way knowledge is shared. Farming techniques, seasonal timing, and resource management are still passed through experience and oral tradition. Yet now they coexist with written expectations, creating a layered system of understanding. You walk along an irrigation channel where water moves slowly through carefully maintained paths. The sound is gentle, consistent. It reflects light in shifting patterns as it flows past stones and soil. This water connects fields, villages, and administrative zones in a continuous cycle of support and dependency. You begin to notice how movement itself has changed. It is no longer only about trade or travel, it is about compliance, coordination, and alignment with structured expectations. Even simple actions like transporting grain or storing harvests now follow recorded procedures. Inside another small administrative point, ledgers are updated with quiet precision. Ink flows steadily from pens to paper. Figures accumulate over time, forming patterns that represent entire regions of production. The act of writing becomes a form of governance in itself. A historical observation emerges through this system. Land revenue frameworks introduced during this period transformed the relationship between agricultural communities and governing institutions by formalizing production into recorded obligations. You feel this transformation in the careful attention given to each entry. Outside again, the landscape stretches in all directions. Fields, pathways, and irrigation systems form a connected structure that supports continuous output. The environment is not static, it is actively maintained, adjusted, and monitored. You pass through a small marketplace where goods from surrounding villages are exchanged. The atmosphere is calm but purposeful. Items are arranged in organized clusters. Prices are discussed with measured attention. Transactions are brief but significant. A subtle historical detail appears in the behavior of traders who move between villages and administrative centers. Many adapt quickly to changing systems of measurement and record-keeping, integrating older knowledge with new requirements. This adaptability becomes essential for continuity. You continue toward a slightly elevated area where you can see multiple villages and fields at once. From here, the scale of the system becomes clearer. Individual settlements are no longer isolated units. They are interconnected parts of a larger network of production and assessment. A reflective observation forms naturally. What appears locally as routine agricultural life is now embedded in a wider structure that links land use to regional administration and global trade networks. Each field contributes to something far beyond its immediate surroundings. As afternoon light begins to soften, activity in the fields continues but slows slightly. Workers begin preparing for end-of-day routines. Tools are gathered. Water channels are checked, small fires are lit for cooking. You remain on the rise overlooking the landscape. The wind moves gently across fields, carrying the scent of soil and vegetation. The sound of distant activity blends into a steady background rhythm. What you observe here is not a single system replacing another. It is a gradual layering of structure over continuity. where long-established agricultural life becomes intertwined with administrative frameworks that extend outward beyond the horizon. And within that layered landscape, you see how control is no longer located in one place, but distributed across records, measurements, and expectations that shape every stage of production. You leave the structured agricultural landscape behind, and the atmosphere shifts into something heavier, quieter, and more unsettling in its stillness. The fields remain fertile, the rivers continue their steady flow, and daily life does not disappear. Yet something has changed in how it feels. There is a sense of strain beneath the surface, as if the system you have been moving through is no longer fully aligned with the environment that sustains it. The air is warm but stagnant in places, carrying the smell of dry soil mixed with overworked land and faint smoke from scattered fires. The wind feels inconsistent, arriving in brief gusts and then disappearing again. Birds move less predictably across the sky. Even sound feels subdued, as if the landscape is absorbing more than it releases. You walk through villages that appear familiar, yet slightly altered in rhythm. People continue their routines, but there is less conversation in open spaces. Movement is still present, but it feels more deliberate, more cautious. The sense of abundance that once defined these agricultural zones now feels uneven, distributed irregularly across time and place. A historical reality becomes visible through the environment itself. Periods of environmental stress combined with administrative and economic pressure created conditions where agricultural systems became more vulnerable to disruption, especially when harvest cycles failed or supply expectations were not met. You sense this vulnerability not as a single event, but as a tension embedded within the land. You pass by fields that show signs of uneven productivity. Some areas remain lush and green, while others appear thinner, less consistent in growth. Irrigation channels still function, but their flow is not uniform everywhere. Maintenance continues, but with visible strain in certain sections. The soundscape here is quieter than before, fewer communal voices in open fields, more isolated activity. The rhythm of work continues, but it feels less collective, more fragmented. Even gatherings at village edges are shorter, more focused on immediate concerns. Inside a storage structure near the edge of a settlement, grain is being measured and recorded. The process is careful, almost restrained. Every unit is accounted for. The atmosphere inside is dim, with filtered light entering through narrow openings. The smell of stored grain is strong, slightly heavy, suggesting long storage and careful rationing. A quieter historical observation emerges through local behaviour. Communities adapt to changing conditions not through abrupt transformation, but through small adjustments in labour, distribution, and timing. These adjustments accumulate gradually, altering how resources move through daily life. You continue along a path that connects multiple villages. The road is less busy than in previous sections. Movement still exists, but it is more spaced out. Travellers move in smaller groups. Conversations are shorter. The sense of urgency is subtle but present beneath ordinary activity. A faint environmental shift becomes noticeable. The air carries more dust than before. Soil feels looser in certain areas. Vegetation appears less dense along some stretches. These are not dramatic changes, but they suggest gradual pressure on the ecological balance that supports agriculture. You reach a small administrative point where records of land output are still being maintained. Inside, the environment is quiet and functional. Officials continue to document figures with steady attention. Ink flows across paper in consistent motion. The process remains orderly, but there is a sense that it now carries more weight than before. A broader historical understanding becomes visible here when economic systems depend heavily on fixed expectations of production. Environmental fluctuations can create cascading effects that extend beyond local conditions. You feel this in the careful tone of conversations, in the measured pace of record keeping. Outside again, the sun is lower in the sky, shadows stretch across fields and pathways. The light has a slightly muted quality, less intense than earlier. The landscape feels stretched between stability and pressure, still functioning but under visible strain. You pass a group of villagers gathered near a water source. Their conversation is low, focused on conditions, timing, and recent changes in yield. There is no panic, but there is awareness. Observation has become part of daily life in a more attentive way. A subtle cultural detail appears in how knowledge is shared. Experience is still central, but now it is increasingly compared with recorded expectations. People reference both memory and documentation when discussing outcomes. This dual awareness shapes decision-making. You continue toward a slightly elevated area where the land opens into a wider view. From here, you can see multiple settlements, fields, and irrigation systems connected across a broad region. The system is still functioning, still active, but its balance feels more delicate when seen from this perspective. A reflective observation forms naturally. Large interconnected systems depend not only on structure and administration, but also on environmental stability and the continuity of everyday labour. When any part of this balance shifts, the effects are distributed widely across the network. The wind picks up slightly, carrying dust across open ground. It moves through fields and pathways without resistance. The sound of rustling crops is softer than before, less dense, more scattered. A quieter historical detail emerges through observation of seasonal patterns. Communities remain deeply attuned to environmental cycles, adjusting planting and harvesting in response to changing conditions, even as administrative expectations continue to shape broader outcomes. You walk along the edge of a field where labour is still ongoing. The work is steady but unhurried. Tools move through soil with practiced familiarity, yet there is a sense that each action is now part of a larger framework that extends beyond immediate surroundings. A historical understanding becomes visible through this layered system. Agricultural regions, operating under structured economic expectations, were particularly sensitive to fluctuations in environmental conditions, creating periods of stress when output did not align with recorded requirements. You feel this tension in the careful attention given to each task. As evening approaches, activity begins to slow. Workers gather tools, water channels are checked one final time. Small barns appear across scattered points in the landscape. The air cools slightly, though it still carries the dryness of the day. You remain at the edge of the field, observing how the landscape continues to function despite visible strain. Nothing has stopped. Yet nothing feels entirely stable either. Everything is still moving, but with a different kind of weight. The world here is not collapsing, it is adjusting, unevenly, across time and space, and within that adjustment, you sense how deeply interconnected systems of land, labour, and administration have become, bound together in ways that make every change widely felt. You leave the strained agricultural landscapes behind, and the world opens outward again into a vast network of competing horizons. The atmosphere shifts noticeably. It feels less enclosed, more dispersed, as if power itself is no longer concentrated in a single region but scattered across multiple distant centres, each one pulling the same ocean in different directions. You find yourself moving along maritime corridors once again, where the sea dominates the imagination of every settlement it touches. Yet this is not a single unified oceanic system. It is fragmented into overlapping zones of influence. Different flags appear on ship passing in the distance. Different languages echo across docks. Different trading practices shape identical commodities in distinct ways. The air is cooler here, carrying the familiar scent of salt and tar, but also something sharper, like competition embedded in the atmosphere. Ports feel busier, more crowded, as if multiple ambitions are converging on the same routes. The rhythm of movement is no longer singular. It is layered, sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense. A historical reality becomes visible through this environment. European maritime expansion in Asia was not dominated by a single power at its outset, but involved multiple competing trading companies from different nations, each establishing networks of ports, alliances, and trade routes. You feel this plurality in the constant presence of varied flags, currencies, and administrative systems operating side by side. You walk through a coastal city where Dutch, English, Portuguese, and local merchants operate in overlapping spheres. Warehouses stand close together, each marked by different symbols of ownership. The architecture reflects adaptation rather than uniform design. Buildings are modified, expanded, or repurposed depending on shifting commercial needs. The soundscape is complex, multiple languages overlap in conversation, ship horns signal arrivals and departures from different fleets. Bargaining voices rise and fall in uneven rhythms. Even silence feels fragmented, interrupted by the constant potential for movement. You notice how goods are handled differently depending on origin and destination. Spices, textiles, metals, and foodstuffs are all processed within the same general area, but under different systems of measurement and accounting. This creates a layered commercial environment where comparison and negotiation become constant. A quieter historical observation emerges through daily interaction. Competition between trading companies often led to shifting alliances with local authorities, as well as changing control over ports and routes depending on political and economic conditions. You sense this instability in the way control markers are frequently updated or replaced. You continue through narrow streets leading away from the harbour. The density of activity increases. Shops display goods from distant regions. Currency exchange points operate in small booths. Information about prices and availability spreads quickly through informal networks of traders and sailors. A subtle cultural detail appears in how people adapt to this competitive environment. Merchants become highly attentive to timing, information, and opportunity. Small differences in knowledge can determine success or loss. Awareness itself becomes a form of economic advantage. You reach a central dock area where multiple fleets are preparing simultaneously. Ships from different nations are loaded with cargo bound for similar destinations, but under separate contracts and routes. The water here feels crowded, not physically but in intention. Every vessel represents a different strategy of access and control. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this structure. Competition among European trading companies contributed to the expansion of global trade networks. As each sought to secure access to valuable goods and strategic locations across Asia and other regions, you feel this expansion not as simple growth, but as overlapping systems pressing into the same spaces. The wind moves across the harbour in shifting directions. Flags from different nations snap and settle in alternating rhythms. The sound of rigging and sails creates a continuous background hum. Movement is constant, but not unified. It is coordinated through competition rather than cooperation. You observe a negotiation taking place near a warehouse entrance. Representatives from different trading groups discuss access to goods and storage space. The conversation is calm but precise. Every word carries implication. Agreements are temporary, subject to change based on future conditions. A quieter historical detail appears in the behaviour of local intermediaries. Many communities developed expertise in navigating between competing powers, using knowledge of language, trade practices, and regional relationships to maintain stability and advantage. You see adaptability becoming essential for survival within this system. You step onto a raised platform overlooking the harbour. From here, the complexity becomes clearer. Ships cluster in groups, each representing different networks of trade. Some are outgoing, carrying goods toward distant markets. Others are arriving, bringing resources and information from across the ocean. A historical reality becomes evident through this view. Maritime trade in this period functions as a highly interconnected but fragmented system, where multiple corporate and national actors operated simultaneously across shared routes. You sense how the ocean itself becomes a shared space of competing intentions. The light begins to shift as afternoon transitions toward evening. The water reflects layered tones of gold, grey, and deep blue. Activity continues, but the intensity softens slightly. Signals are exchanged between ships. Final preparations are made for departure. You notice how each trading entity maintains its own internal structure while also adapting to external pressures. This creates a dynamic environment where stability is temporary and adjustment is constant. A reflective observation forms as you watch the harbour. Power here is not fixed. It moves through networks of trade, negotiation, and access. Controls distributed across many actors, each influencing outcomes in different ways. You walk along the edge of the dock where smaller boats connect larger ships to shore. These vessels move continuously, transferring goods, messages, and personnel between layers of the system. They form the connective tissue of maritime commerce. A quieter historical understanding emerges through this layered structure. Global trade networks were sustained not only by major fleets and ports, but also by smaller, often overlooked systems of transfer and coordination that ensured continuity across vast distances. You see this in the constant movement of these smaller vessels. As evening settles, lanterns begin to illuminate the harbour. The glow reflects on water, creating fragmented patterns of light. The competing fleets remain visible, but less sharply defined. Activity slows slightly, though it does not cease. You remain for a moment at the edge of the platform, observing how multiple systems of trade, authority, and ambition coexist within the same space. There is no single centre, there is only interaction, overlap, and continuous adjustment. And within that complexity, you sense how the ocean has become less a boundary and more a shared stage where different powers extend themselves outward, each shaping the world in overlapping ways that continue to unfold. You leave the crowded maritime crossroads behind, and the world shifts from tropical ports and contested coastlines into a colder, more structured environment shaped by finance, distance, and abstraction. The ocean is no longer directly in front of you. Instead, it exists as a distant mechanism, something experienced through ledgers, reports, and delayed news arriving months after events have already occurred. The air feels different here, less humid, more controlled, as if even atmosphere has been filtered through commerce. You find yourself in a major European city where wealth generated abroad begins to return in visible form. Streets are wider, buildings taller, and movement more orderly than in the ports you have just left. Carriages pass over cobblestone roads with steady rhythm. Merchants move with quiet confidence. Yet beneath this surface calm, there is a constant undercurrent of speculation and anticipation. The smell here is layered but refined. Tobacco, coffee, printed paper, and wax from sealed documents fill the air. You notice how physical goods from distant lands have been transformed into everyday presence. What once travelled across oceans now exists in cups, shops, and households. The world has been compressed into consumption. A historical reality becomes visible through observation of urban life. Profits generated by overseas trading companies flowed back into European financial centres, influencing banking systems, consumer habits, and patterns of investment across society. You feel this not as theory, but as atmosphere embedded in architecture and routine. You walk through a district where financial activity is concentrated. Buildings here are not decorative. They are functional, designed for record-keeping, negotiation, and exchange. Inside, rooms are filled with clerks, merchants, and investors discussing contracts tied to distant territories. The language of conversation is careful, precise, and often indirect. Paper dominates this environment. Contracts, share records, shipment logs, and financial statements circulate continuously. The sound of writing is constant, creating a quiet rhythm that replaces the noise of docks and ships. Ink becomes a form of movement, carrying value across distance without physical transport. A subtle observation emerges in how people behave. Unlike the physical uncertainty of maritime trade, this environment deals in calculated expectations. Risk is no longer tied to storms or navigation. It is tied to price fluctuations, political developments abroad, and delayed information. Uncertainty has shifted form rather than disappeared. You enter a meeting room where discussions revolve around dividends, shipping returns, and future voyages already underway. Maps of distant regions hang on walls, but they are no longer used for exploration. They are used for planning revenue, estimating output, and evaluating returns on investment. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this financial environment overseas. Trading companies developed complex systems of investment and profit distribution that connected ordinary investors in Europe to economic activity across Asia and other regions. You sense how distance has been transformed into financial structure. Outside, the city continues its steady rhythm. Markets sell goods imported from abroad: tea, sugar, spices, textiles, and porcelain appear in shops and private homes. These items are no longer rare curiosities. They have become part of everyday life, reshaping habits and expectations. You notice how consumption reflects global networks. A cup of tea represents cultivation, transport, taxation, and trade across multiple regions. A piece of cotton cloth carries the imprint of agricultural labour, manufacturing skill, and long-distance shipping. Everyday objects contain layered histories. A quieter historical detail appears into the behaviour of consumers. Many develop familiarity with goods that were once exotic, integrating them into routines that gradually reshape cultural norms. What begins as luxury slowly becomes habit. You walk through residential streets where wealth accumulated from trade is displayed subtly in architecture and furnishings. Houses are comfortable but restrained. Inside, imported goods appear alongside local craftsmanship. The world is present in small objects placed on tables, shelves, and dining surfaces. A reflective observation forms here. Global trade has not only moved goods across continents, it has reshaped domestic life itself, altering tastes, expectations, and daily rhythms in ways that are often invisible but deeply embedded. You continue toward a riverside area, where cargo ships from inland and coastal routes arrive. These vessels are smaller than oceanic ships, but essential for connecting internal markets to global networks. Goods move continuously between local production and international distribution points. The river carries a steady flow of movement. Barges loaded with merchandise pass beneath bridges where pedestrians observe activity below. Water reflects buildings, sky, and passing vessels in fragmented motion. Everything here is connected through layers of transport and exchange. A historical reality becomes visible through this structure. Inland waterways and port systems functioned as critical links in global trade networks, ensuring that goods could move efficiently between production regions and international markets. You feel this connectivity in the constant motion along the river. You stand near the water's edge as evening begins to approach. Light softens across the city, reflecting off river surfaces and stone buildings. Activity slows but does not stop. Lamps are lit along docks and streets, creating warm pools of illumination in the growing dusk. Inside nearby buildings, financial discussions continue. Contracts are reviewed under candlelight. Figures are recalculated. Expectations are adjusted based on new information arriving from distant regions. Time here is not measured only in hours. It is measured in voyages, reports, and delayed outcomes. A quieter historical observation emerges through this environment. The separation between economic decision-making and physical production has increased significantly, creating systems where outcomes are determined far from the places where goods are actually produced. You walk along the riverbank where merchants and investors gather informally. Conversations are calm but focused. Information is exchanged carefully. Knowledge of distant conditions becomes a form of advantage, shaping decisions that may only reveal their consequences months later. A subtle detail appears in how news travels. Reports from overseas arrive irregularly, often through multiple intermediaries. By the time information reaches financial centers, conditions may already have changed, yet decisions continue to be made based on these delayed signals. You observe how the city absorbs global influence. Foreign goods are displayed in shop windows, exotic materials are incorporated into clothing and furniture. Cultural elements from distant regions appear in music, food, and design. The world feels increasingly interconnected. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this transformation. Global trade networks not only redistributed goods but also reshaped cultural and economic life within Europe itself, creating feedback loops between consumption and production across continents. As night settles fully, the city becomes quieter but remains active. Lantern light reflects off wet stone streets. The river continues its steady movement, carrying goods and information between internal and external worlds. You remain by the water for a moment longer, observing how distant regions are now embedded within everyday urban life. The ocean may no longer be visible here, but its influence continues to move through finance, consumption, and memory, and within that realization, you sense how deeply the world has become connected, not only through ships and ports, but through systems of value that now shape both distant lands and the quiet streets you stand upon. You leave the financial streets of the European city behind, and the atmosphere shifts into something more tense, more politically aware, as if the calm surface of commerce is beginning to show strain beneath its own weight. The river fades into the background, replaced by corridors of governance, debate, and reform. The air feels colder here, sharper, carrying the faint echo of arguments that stretch across institutions rather than landscapes. You find yourself inside a world where decisions about distant territories are no longer left solely to merchants or trading houses. Instead, they are being examined, questioned, and slowly absorbed into formal structures of state authority. The rhythm of movement is different. It is not driven by ships or cargo, but by documents, petitions, and legislative sessions. The streets remain orderly, but there is a noticeable increase in public discussion. People gather in small groups outside civic buildings. Conversations are more direct, sometimes uneasy. Questions about responsibility, profit, and governance circulate through public space like a shared concern that cannot be easily resolved. A historical reality becomes clear through observation of institutional change, as overseas trading companies expanded their influence and territorial control. Governments in Europe began to scrutinize their power more closely, gradually introducing regulations and reforms to limit or absorb their authority. You feel this shift in the architecture of power itself, where private enterprise and state oversight begin to overlap. You walk toward a large civic building where formal discussions are taking place. The exterior is imposing but not decorative. It is built to convey stability rather than wealth. Inside, long halls lead to chambers filled with representatives, officials, and advisors. The sound of footsteps echoes through stone corridors, measured and deliberate. In one chamber, debates unfold around tables covered with documents and reports. Maps of distant regions are present, but they are no longer used for exploration or investment alone. They are now tools of governance, policy, and accountability. Every line drawn on those maps carries implications that extend far beyond commerce. A quieter observation emerges through the tone of discussion. There is a growing awareness that the systems created by trading companies have produced both economic expansion and complex political consequences. These consequences cannot be easily separated from the original structures that generated them. You observe how language shifts in these rooms. Terms once associated with trade now appear in discussions of governance and law. The boundaries between merchant activity and state responsibility are becoming less distinct. Authority is no longer concentrated in a single type of institution. A subtle historical detail appears in the behavior of officials. Many speak not only of profit or loss, but of long-term stability, territorial management, and public consequence. The vocabulary of commerce is being absorbed into the vocabulary of governance. You step outside into a courtyard where smaller groups gather in conversation. The air here is cooler, less formal than inside the chambers. Yet even here, the topic of distant territories remains central. Questions of oversight, responsibility, and control continue to surface. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this environment as corporate powers expanded into territorial governance. They created conditions that required new forms of political regulation and institutional restructuring within European states. You sense this transition as a slow reorganization of authority rather than a sudden change. You continue walking through adjacent streets where pamphlets and printed materials circulate widely. Printing presses operate nearby, producing documents that discuss policy, critique, and proposed reforms. Information spreads more quickly now, shaping public awareness of distant events. The smell of ink and a paper is strong in this area. It carries a sense of immediacy, as if ideas themselves are being produced and distributed with increasing speed. You notice how public opinion becomes part of the system, influencing how decisions are framed and justified. A quieter cultural detail appears in the way people engage with these materials. Reading becomes a shared civic activity. Discussions form around printed texts. Knowledge of distant territories is no longer limited to merchants or officials. It is entering broader public awareness. You pass by a gathering where speakers address small crowds outside civic buildings. Their voices are steady, measured, sometimes urgent. They speak of accountability, of governance, of the responsibilities tied to overseas control. The crowd listens with focused attention. A reflective observation forms here. Power that once operated through commercial networks is now being examined through institutional frameworks that attempt to define limits, responsibilities, and legitimacy. You move toward another building where formal records are being reviewed. Inside, clerks and officials examine documents that detail revenue, governance, and territorial administration. The process is methodical. Every figure is checked. Every report cross-referenced. A historical reality becomes visible through this administrative structure. The expansion of overseas corporate power eventually led to the development of regulatory and parliamentary oversight in European states. As governments sought to integrate or control these systems within formal political frameworks, you observe how the atmosphere inside this building differs from earlier commercial spaces. There is less emphasis on opportunity and more focus on structure. Less speculation, more evaluation. The tone is restrained, but deeply engaged. Outside again, the city feels slightly more fragmented. Commercial activity continues, but now it exists alongside political discourse. Trade and governance are no longer separate spheres. They are intertwined, sometimes in tension, sometimes in cooperation. You walk along a broad avenue where multiple institutions are visible. Financial buildings, government offices, and civic spaces exist in close proximity. This physical closeness reflects the conceptual merging of economic and political systems. A quieter historical observation emerges through this environment. The systems created by overseas trading enterprises became so influential that they required integration into national governance structures. reshaping how states understood economic power and territorial responsibility. You pause near a canal where goods continue to move through the city. Barges carry materials from inland regions toward broader distribution networks. Even here, in a space dominated by governance discussions, the flow of goods continues uninterrupted. A subtle detail appears in the way people observe the canal. It is no longer just a transport route, it is also a symbol of continuity, linking older systems of commerce with newer systems of regulation and oversight. As evening approaches, light softens across the city once again. Candlelight and lanterns appear in windows and along streets. The atmosphere becomes quieter, but not inactive. Discussion continues inside buildings. Documents are still reviewed. Decisions are still shaped. You remain near the canal, observing how multiple layers of power now coexist within the same urban space. Commerce, governance, public discourse, and institutional oversight are all present, overlapping and interacting, and within that complexity, you sense how the systems that began as maritime trade ventures have now become deeply embedded in the structures of state, law, and public life, extending far beyond their original purpose into something far larger and more enduring. You leave behind the chambers of reform and oversight, and the atmosphere shifts into something more contained, more tense, as if the consequences of distant governance have now condensed into physical presence. The streets grow quieter in some areas, but in others there is a noticeable density of movement that feels controlled rather than casual. The air carries a faint mixture of discipline, anticipation, and unease. You find yourself entering a military environment embedded within an administrative landscape. Barracks, training grounds, and storage depots are positioned alongside offices where records and orders are processed. The separation between civilian and military space is no longer clear. They exist side by side, sharing infrastructure, supplies, and communication channels. The soundscape is structured and repetitive. Footsteps in formation echo across open courtyards. Commands are issued in short, precise bursts. Equipment is checked and rechecked with mechanical consistency. Even moments of stillness feel temporary, as if waiting for the next instruction. A historical reality becomes visible through the organization around you as overseas territories expanded under company control. Military forces were increasingly integrated into administrative systems to secure trade routes, maintain order, and enforce governance structures. You feel this integration in the physical proximity of soldiers and clerks, weapons and ledgers, discipline and documentation. You walk through a training yard where groups of soldiers move through coordinated exercises. Their movements are practiced, synchronized, shaped by repetition. Dust rises from the ground with each step, hanging briefly in the air before settling again. The rhythm is steady, almost rhythmic, like a system reinforcing itself through motion. The air here is dry and slightly sharp, carrying the scent of leather, metal, and worn wood. Equipment lines the edges of the yard, uniforms are arranged in orderly stacks. Flags mark designated areas for instruction and assembly. Everything is organized with visible intention. A quieter historical observation emerges through daily structure. Military organization in these contexts was not isolated from commerce or governance. It was part of a unified system designed to maintain control over trade networks and territorial holdings. You sense this unity in the seamless transition between administrative orders and operational deployment. You move toward a nearby administrative building connected to the military compound. Inside, the environment is quieter, more controlled. Papers are arranged in strict order. Officers and clerks work side by side, reviewing reports that combine logistical, financial, and strategic information. Maps are spread across large tables. They show routes, settlements, supply points, and areas of responsibility. These maps are no longer exploratory. They are operational. Each line represents not discovery, but coordination and oversight. A subtle detail appears in the way communication flows between rooms. Messages are carried quickly but carefully. Decisions are recorded immediately. Instructions are distributed across multiple levels of responsibility. The entire system feels tightly interconnected. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this structure. The expansion of overseas governance systems required the integration of military capability with administrative oversight, creating hybrid institutions that managed both economic and territorial control. You step outside again into a wider courtyard where supplies are being distributed. Carts carry provisions, equipment, and documentation to different parts of the compound. The movement is steady and coordinated. Nothing appears rushed, yet everything is continuously in motion. A group of local intermediaries moves through the space, communicating between different operational layers. Their presence highlights the complexity of administration across diverse regions. Language, negotiation, and adaptation remain essential to maintaining function within this system. A quieter cultural detail emerges in the way authority is expressed. It is not always direct or visible. It often operates through procedure, documentation, and structured routine. Power is embedded in systems rather than individuals alone. You continue toward the edge of the compound where the land opens into surrounding territory. From here, you can see both agricultural areas and controlled zones existing in proximity. The boundary between them is not rigid. It is managed through oversight rather than physical separation. A reflective observation forms here. The system you are witnessing is no longer simply commercial or military. It is administrative in the broadest sense, shaping both movement and production across wide regions through coordinated structures. You pass by storage areas where supplies are carefully catalogued. Each item is recorded before distribution. The process is consistent and methodical. Even basic resources are part of a larger system of tracking and allocation. A historical reality becomes visible through this environment. Governance in overseas territories increasingly relied on integrated systems that combined military presence, administrative record keeping, and economic management to maintain control over large and distant regions. You observe how personnel move between roles. Some individuals participate in both administrative and operational tasks. This flexibility reflects the interconnected nature of the system, where boundaries between functions are fluid rather than fixed. The wind moves through the compound, carrying dust and faint sounds from nearby settlements. It passes through structures without resistance, briefly disrupting papers and flags before settling again. The environment remains stable despite constant motion. A quieter observation emerges through interaction between different groups. Communication is often structured but adaptive, allowing coordination across linguistic and cultural differences. This adaptability becomes essential for maintaining continuity. You walk toward a raised platform overlooking the wider landscape. From here, you can see fields, settlements, and operational zones extending outward. The scale of the system becomes clearer. It is not confined to one location. It extends across regions through connected layers of control. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this view. Integrated systems of governance in overseas territories combined administrative, military, and economic functions to maintain long-distance control over complex and diverse regions. As the sun begins to lower, light spreads across the landscape in softer tones. Shadows lengthen over training grounds and fields. Activity continues but gradually slows. Preparations for evening routines begin across different sections of the compound. You remain on the platform, observing how the system operates continuously. Even as individual activities shift and change, nothing is static. Everything's part of ongoing coordination, and within that structure, you sense how deeply interconnected governance, military organization, and economic management have become, forming a unified system that extends far beyond its original commercial beginnings into a complex framework of control and administration. You leave the structured military administrative landscape behind, and the atmosphere shifts into something fractured, tense, and deeply unsettled. The order that once seemed so coordinated now feels strained, as if the system has reached a point where its internal balance can no longer hold without resistance. The air is heavy, carrying dust, smoke, and the distant echoes of unrest spreading across multiple regions at once. You find yourself moving through a landscape where communication is fragmented, messages travel slower, and when they arrive, they carry urgency that cannot be ignored. Villages, towns, and administrative centres all seem to be reacting to something larger than themselves, something that cannot be contained within normal routines. The soundscape is different now. Instead of steady coordination, there is interruption, distant gatherings, raised voices, marching movements that are no longer purely ceremonial or instructional. Even silence feels charged, as if it is waiting to break. A historical reality becomes clear through the structure of events unfolding around you. In 1857, widespread rebellion broke out in large parts of northern and central India against the authority of the East India Company. Driven by a complex combination of political, economic, cultural and military tensions, you feel this not as a single eruption, but as a chain of disturbances spreading unevenly across regions. You walk through an area where military presence is visibly reinforced, fortified positions are more active, supplies are being moved quickly, and communication between posts is frequent. The sense of stability that once defined these structures has shifted into alertness. Everything is still functioning, but under pressure. The air is dry and tense. Smoke rises in thin layers from scattered fires, some for cooking, others for signalling or precaution. The smell of burning wood mixes with dust and sweat. Movement is constant, but less orderly than before. There is urgency in every direction, though not always coordinated. A quieter historical observation emerges through the environment, the systems that once integrated administration. Trade and military control are now under strain as local resistance and structural tensions intersect with existing governance frameworks. You sense this strain in the uneven pace of movement and communication. You continue along a road that passes through multiple settlements. Some appear calm, maintaining daily routines with visible effort. Others show signs of disruption, with reduced activity and increased caution. The contrast between neighbouring areas is striking, as if different realities are unfolding side by side. A subtle detail appears in the behaviour of travellers and messengers. Many move quickly, often without stopping. Information is carried verbally or through written dispatches that are passed along chains of communication. Each message feels urgent, yet incomplete. You approach a town where administrative buildings are still operational, but activity inside is more controlled and defensive. Doors remain open, but movement is cautious. Records are still being kept, but with greater attention to immediate developments rather than long-term planning. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this environment. Widespread resistance during this period reflected deep structural tensions within systems of governance. Military organization and economic administration that had developed over decades of expansion. You observe how daily life continues in parallel with instability. Markets remain partially active. People still gather in small groups. Agricultural work does not fully stop. Yet everything is influenced by uncertainty, as if normal rhythms are being constantly adjusted. The wind moves through the streets carrying dust and scattered sounds of activity. Flags and banners hang loosely, sometimes still, sometimes shifting unpredictably. The environment feels unsettled, not fully disrupted, but no longer stable. A quieter cultural detail emerges in how communities respond. Some attempt to maintain continuity through routine. Others adapt quickly to changing conditions, shifting between caution and action depending on immediate surroundings. Flexibility becomes essential. You pass by a convoy of carts carrying supplies and documents. The movement is organized but hurried. Escorts accompany the convoy. Scanning the surroundings, the sense of protection and urgency is clearly present. A historical reality becomes visible through this logistics network during periods of unrest. Administrative and military systems relied heavily on coordinated supply routes and communication channels to maintain control and continuity across affected regions. You continue toward a slightly elevated area where visibility expands. From here, you can see multiple settlements and roads converging towards central points. Movement is uneven. Some routes are active, others appear temporarily abandoned or redirected. A reflective observation forms here. Systems built for stability reveal their fragility under sustained pressure. What once functioned through coordination now requires constant adjustment and reinforcement. You notice groups of people gathered at the edges of settlements. Conversations are low and cautious. There is awareness of change, but also uncertainty about direction. Information is fragmented, often arriving after conditions have already shifted. A quieter historical detail appears in the way messages circulate. Rumours and official reports coexist, sometimes reinforcing each other, sometimes conflicting. This creates an environment where understanding is partial and constantly revised. You walk along a road that feels less predictable than before. The ground is uneven in places, dust rises more frequently, and movement is less structured. Yet life continues. People still travel, trade, and communicate within the constraints of the moment. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this complexity. Large administrative systems often experience periods of instability when multiple pressures converge, revealing underlying tensions in governance, economy, and local relationships. As evening approaches, the light becomes softer, casting long shadows across roads and buildings. Activity slows in some areas while continuing in others. The landscape feels divided between persistence and interruption. You remain for a moment near a junction where multiple routes intersect. Movement continues in all directions, but with different levels of urgency. Nothing has fully stopped, yet nothing feels fully stable either. And within that moment, you sense how systems that once extended smoothly across trade, governance, and military control are now encountering resistance that reshapes their structure, revealing the limits of expansion and the complexity of maintaining authority across vast and diverse regions. You leave the fractured roads and unsettled settlements behind, and the world gradually slows into a different kind of silence. It is not the silence of emptiness, but of transition, as if the systems you have been moving through are no longer actively expanding, but instead settling into memory, restructuring themselves in the aftermath of their own scale. The air feels lighter here, less charged with urgency, yet still carrying traces of everything that came before. You find yourself in a landscape that feels both familiar and distant. Rivers continue to flow, fields continue to be cultivated, and ports continue to operate. But the intensity that once defined these systems has softened. Movement still exists, but it is less directional, less driven by expansion. It feels like continuation rather than acceleration. The atmosphere is calm but layered. You can sense echoes of trade routes, administrative systems, military structures, and financial networks, all overlapping but no longer pushing outward with the same force. Instead, they exist as integrated layers within the world, shaping it quietly rather than transforming it dramatically. A historical reality becomes clear through the structure of what remains visible after the dissolution of the East India Company in the 19th century. Its administrative, economic and territorial systems were gradually absorbed into broader state governance structures, leaving behind long-lasting institutional and global trade legacies. You feel this not as an ending, but as a transformation of form. You walk through a harbour that once felt intensely active. Now it is steady, functional, and more evenly paced. Ships still arrive and depart, but without the same density of competition or urgency. The water reflects a calmer sky. The wooden docks creak gently under movement, but the sound is no longer overwhelmed by constant coordination. The air carries familiar scents of salt, timber, and distant goods, yet everything feels more settled, as if the world has adjusted to the scale of its own interconnectedness. Even the wind feels more consistent, less fragmented across competing systems. A quieter historical observation emerges through this environment. The global trade networks established during earlier centuries did not disappear. Instead, they evolved into more standardized systems of international exchange. Regulated by new institutions and modern economic frameworks, you continue along the edge of the harbour where smaller boats move between larger vessels and shore. The movement is continuous but no longer tense. It resembles maintenance more than expansion. Goods still circulate, but within established pathways that feel stable rather than exploratory. A subtle detail appears in how people interact. Conversations are more relaxed. There is less urgency in negotiation. Exchange still happens, but it is embedded in routine rather than shaped by uncertainty. The world has not stopped moving. It has simply become more familiar with its own structure. You step into a nearby town where architecture reflects accumulated layers of history. Older buildings stand beside newer structures. Markets continue to operate. Daily life proceeds with quiet consistency. The imprint of earlier global systems is still visible, but it no longer dominates the atmosphere. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this setting. Large-scale trading companies and imperial systems that once shaped global movement left behind infrastructures of commerce, governance, and cultural exchange that continue to influence modern economic and political systems. You walk through streets where goods from many regions are still present. Tea, textiles, metals, and manufactured items circulate in everyday life. What once required long and uncertain voyages now feels integrated into normal expectation. The soundscape is gentle, footsteps, conversations, distant harbour activity. Nothing feels isolated. Everything is part of a broader continuity that no longer requires constant negotiation to sustain itself. A reflective observation forms here. Systems that once operated through expansion and control now function through integration and maintenance. Their presence is no longer dramatic, but foundational. You continue toward a riverside area where water flows steadily through the landscape. Bridges connect different parts of the town. Boats move at regular intervals. The river no longer feels like a boundary or a route of competition. It feels like a connector within a stabilized system. A quieter historical detail appears in the way people move through this environment. Travel is more predictable. Communication is more immediate. Information flows through established channels that no longer require the delays or uncertainties of earlier eras. You pause near the water's edge. The surface reflects buildings, sky, and slow movement of boats. There is a sense of continuity rather than transformation. The world feels settled into patterns that extend beyond individual events. A broader historical understanding becomes visible through this final landscape. Global systems of trade and governance that originated in early maritime expansion eventually evolved into interconnected modern structures of commerce, law, and international exchange. You remain there for a moment, observing how deeply interconnected the world has become through centuries of layered development. What once began as isolated voyages and fragile outposts has transformed into enduring systems that shape everyday life in subtle but persistent ways. The wind moves softly across the river. Light shifts gently as the day progresses. Nothing feels urgent anymore, yet everything continues. And as you stand in this quiet space between past movement and present stability, you begin to sense how the entire journey has been less about conquest or expansion, and more about the gradual weaving of distant places into a shared global fabric that still holds its shape today. Final Winddown begins. You are no longer moving through harbours, courts, fields, or councils. Instead, everything begins to soften into continuity. The noise of expansion fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of everyday life shaped by centuries of connection. You can feel how the world you have travelled through has not disappeared, but settled into background structure, supporting the present in ways that are often invisible. Rivers continue to flow with quiet certainty. Cities remain active but no longer overwhelmed by the intensity of transformation. Trade still exists, but it no longer defines the entire horizon of human movement. Instead, it has become part of a larger system that includes governance, culture, and daily life. You notice how even memory feels different here. It is less fragmented, more integrated. The past is not distant. It is embedded in the structures around you, in the goods people use, in the systems that organize movement and exchange. There is no final rupture, no dramatic ending, only gradual settling, like water finding its level after long disturbance. And in that stillness, you begin to understand how deeply the world has been shaped by these overlapping centuries of movement, exchange, and transformation, not as a story that ends, but as a system that continues. End of script. Sleep well.